There is a kind of quiet that settles over the mind when we begin to wonder about the mind itself, a stillness that arrives when we turn our attention inward, not to examine ourselves, but to consider the long and winding path that brought us to this moment of curiosity, this gentle questioning of what it means to think, to feel, to remember, to become. Tonight, we find ourselves walking through the corridors of a vast and ancient mansion, a place built room by room across centuries, each chamber holding a different understanding of the human psyche, each hallway leading to discoveries both profound and humbling. This mansion is psychology, a word that carries within it the Greek root psyche, meaning breath or soul, or the animating force of life itself. The air here is cool and contemplative, filled with the accumulated wisdom of philosophers and physicians, of researchers and theorists who spent lifetimes asking questions that may never be fully answered. The walls are lined with books and journals, handwritten notes and carefully documented observations, the collected attempts of human beings to understand their own nature, to map the invisible landscape of consciousness, to find patterns in the seemingly chaotic flow of emotion and thought. We begin our wandering in the entrance hall, where the light filters through tall windows, casting long shadows that shift and change as evening deepens into night. Here, the story of psychology begins not with laboratories or clinical settings, but with wonder, with the fundamental human need to make sense of experience, to ask why we dream, why we forget, why we love and fear and hope. For thousands of years, long before the word psychology existed, people pondered these mysteries. Ancient healers attributed mental disturbances to imbalances in bodily humors, to spiritual possession, to the influence of stars and seasons. Philosophers in Greece and Rome debated whether the soul resided in the heart or the brain, whether human nature was fundamentally rational or governed by passion, whether memory was like wax receiving impressions or something far more mysterious. These early questions linger in the air like incense, their fragrance still detectable even now, because they were never truly answered, only refined, reshaped, examined from new angles as the centuries passed. The mansion we walk through tonight was not built all at once. It grew organically, almost accidentally, as different thinkers added their own rooms, their own methods of investigation, their own ways of listening to the human experience. Some rooms are spacious and filled with light, designed for observation and measurement. Others are intimate spaces, dimly lit, where two people sit facing each other, speaking quietly about memories and meanings. We move slowly, allowing ourselves to feel the texture of this place, to notice how the floorboards creak beneath our feet, how the temperature shifts as we pass from one area to another. There is no rush, no destination we must reach, only this gentle exploration, this quiet appreciation for the many minds that work to build this understanding, stone by stone, theory by theory, question by question. The history we trace tonight is not merely a chronicle of dates and names. It is a story of transformation, of how humanity's view of itself has shifted and deepened, how we moved from seeing mental life as something mystical and untouchable to recognizing it as a phenomenon that could be studied, measured, understood through careful observation and systematic inquiry. And yet, even as we gained new tools and methods, the essential mystery remains still. In the gap between what we can measure and what we can feel, between the structure of a brain and the experience of being. As we stand here in this entrance hall, preparing to move deeper into the mansion, we sense the magnitude of what lies ahead, the richness of the journey, the countless contributions of researchers and practitioners who devoted themselves to this work, not for fame or fortune, but for the fundamental human desire to understand, to help, to illuminate the dark corners of suffering and confusion. The story of psychology is also the story of compassion, of the slow recognition that mental distress deserves the same careful attention as physical ailment, that the workings of the mind are not separate from the body. That treatment and understanding must evolve together, hand in hand, each informing the other. We take a breath and begin to walk forward into the first corridor, where the earliest threads of this vast tapestry wait to be examined, where ancient wisdom meets emerging science, where the foundations were laid for everything that would follow. The first corridor stretches before us, dim and quiet, its walls adorned with portraits of men in robes and togas, philosophers whose names echo across millennia: Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. These thinkers did not call themselves psychologists. The word would not exist for 2,000 years, yet they asked the questions that would eventually give birth to the field. Questions about the nature of knowledge, the source of virtue, the relationship between body and soul. Aristotle stands out among them, his gaze thoughtful and searching. He believed the soul was not separate from the body, but rather its form, its organizing principle. He wrote treatises on memory and dreams, on sensation and perception, attempting to understand how information from the world entered through the senses and became thought, became understanding. His work, De Anima, meaning on the soul, explored these mysteries with careful observation, noting how memory seemed to work through association, how one thought led naturally to another through chains of similarity or contrast. We pause before his portrait, considering how he watched animals and humans alike, seeking patterns, seeking universal principles. He noticed that we remember better when we create connections, when we link new information to what we already know. These insights, formed in the 4th century before the Common Era, would resurface again and again in the centuries to come, refined and tested, but never entirely discarded. Moving forward, we enter a long gallery where the air grows cooler, where the light from outside barely reaches. Here we find ourselves in what scholars would later call the medieval period, a time when the study of the mind became intertwined with theology, with questions of sin and salvation, of free will and divine grace. St. Augustine appears here, his face marked by intensity and introspection. He wrote extensively about memory, describing it as a vast palace with countless chambers. He marveled at how he could summon images and sounds from the past, how memory seemed to exist outside of time, containing everything he had ever experienced, waiting to be called forth. His Confessions read like an early work of psychology, examining his own thoughts and motivations with unflinching honesty, tracing the path from childhood to conversion, exploring the nature of desire and the struggle between different aspects of the self. The medieval scholars who followed believed that mental disturbances might arise from demonic possession From moral failing, from the corruption of the soul, treatment often involved prayer, exorcism, penance, and yet, alongside these spiritual explanations, there existed a parallel tradition, one that traced back to ancient Greek medicine, the theory of humors. This theory, developed by Hippocrates and elaborated by Galen, proposed that health depended on the balance of 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. An excess of black bile, they believed, led to melancholia, what we might now recognize as depression. Too much blood produced a sanguine temperament, cheerful and optimistic. Phlegm brought calm, sometimes to the point of lethargy. Yellow bile created a choleric disposition, quick to anger, passionate and driven. We can almost see the medieval physicians moving through hospital wards, observing their patients, attempting to restore balance through bloodletting, through herbs and diet, through careful attention to the seasons and the stars. Their methods seem strange to us now, even misguided, and yet beneath them lay something profound, the recognition that mental states had physical correlates, that body and mind were not entirely separate realms. Centuries pass as we walk, the portraits on the walls changing, robes giving way to doublets and ruffs. The Renaissance arrives like a sunrise, bringing new light to old questions. Artists began to study anatomy, cutting into cadavers to understand the machinery beneath the skin. Philosophers began to question inherited wisdom, to trust observation over ancient authority. René Descartes appears in this gallery, his expression both confident and troubled. He famously declared, "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am establishing thought as the foundation of certainty. But in doing so, he created a division that would haunt psychology for centuries, the split between mind and body, between the thinking substance and the extended substance, between the immaterial soul and the physical brain. Descartes believed the mind and body interacted through the pineal gland, a small structure deep in the brain. There, somehow, the immaterial thoughts of the soul could influence the material mechanisms of the body, and physical sensations could register in consciousness. It was an elegant attempt to solve an impossible problem, but it left future generations struggling with the question of how 2 fundamentally different substances could possibly communicate. Other voices emerge in this period. John Locke, who proposed that the mind at birth was like a blank slate, a tabula rasa, upon which experience would write its lessons. He rejected the idea of innate knowledge, arguing instead that all our ideas come from sensation and reflection, from the raw material of experience shaped by the mind's operations. This view would profoundly influence education, philosophy, and eventually psychology itself, suggesting that human nature was not fixed but malleable, shaped by environment and circumstance. We move through a doorway into a chamber filled with cabinets and curiosities, the age of enlightenment, where reason was celebrated as humanity's highest faculty, where the goal was to illuminate all darkness through the light of rational inquiry. Here we find philosophers debating the nature of consciousness, the puzzle of personal identity, the mechanisms of association that link our thoughts together. David Hume stands in the shadows, skeptical and probing. He questioned whether we could ever truly know the self, noting that when he looked inward, he found only a bundle of sensations, thoughts, and feelings, but never some essential core, some unchanging I that persisted beneath the flux of experience. His insights cut deep, suggesting that what we call the self might be more like a story we tell, a narrative constructed from fragments, than a solid, unchanging entity. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant responded to these challenges, proposing that the mind was not merely passive, not simply a blank slate receiving impressions, but actively structured experience, bringing its own categories and frameworks to bear on the raw data of sensation. Space and time, he argued, were not features of the external world, but forms of intuition, ways the mind organized experience. This active mind, this shaping consciousness, would become central to many later psychological theories. As the 18th century gives way to the 19th, we sense a change in the atmosphere, a quickening of pace. The Industrial Revolution transforms daily life. Cities grow larger, factories multiply. The rhythms of work and home shift dramatically, and with these changes come new questions about human nature, about adaptation and development, about the impact of the environment on the psyche. Phrenology emerges in this period, the brainchild of Franz Joseph Gall, who proposed that different mental faculties resided in different regions of the brain, and that the skull's contours revealed the development of these faculties. People would have their heads carefully measured, their bumps and indentations catalogued, receiving reports on their propensity for benevolence, their capacity for language, their tendency toward destructiveness. The theory was wrong, profoundly so, and yet it contained a seed of truth. The idea that the brain was not homogeneous, that different regions might serve different functions. This notion, stripped of its pseudoscientific trappings, would eventually be vindicated, though not in the way Gall imagined. In France, Philippe Pinel was transforming the treatment of mental illness. He famously removed the chains from patients at the Bicêtre hospital, arguing that the insane were not criminals or monsters, but sick individuals deserving of humane care. His moral treatment emphasized kindness, occupation, and a structured environment. It was a radical departure from the dungeons and restraints that had characterized earlier approaches, a recognition that how we treat suffering minds reflects something essential about our values, our humanity. Across the Channel, in England, similar reforms were taking place. The York Retreat, founded by William Tuke, provided a peaceful environment where patients could recover their equilibrium through gentle routines, useful work, and compassionate attention. The idea that mental illness could be treated, that recovery was possible, began to take hold, slowly displacing older notions of incurability and moral degeneracy. We stand now at a threshold. The 19th century spreads before us like an open book, its pages filled with discoveries that would fundamentally transform our understanding of the mind. The age of introspection and philosophy was giving way to something new, an approach that valued measurement, experimentation, systematic observation. The mansion was about to add new wings, laboratories and clinics, places where the ancient questions would be asked in entirely new ways. The light from the windows has changed, deepened. We have traveled far from those early Greek philosophers, and yet their questions still echo in these halls. What is consciousness? How do we know? Why do we feel? What makes us human? The methods would change. The tools would evolve, but the fundamental wonder, the desire to understand, remained constant, a thread connecting all who walked these corridors. seeking answers in the beautiful, frustrating, endlessly complex landscape of the human mind. We step across that threshold now into a room that smells of ink and paper, of gas lamps burning late into the night. The year is 1879, and in Leipzig, Germany, Wilhelm Wundt has established what many consider the first true psychological laboratory, a place dedicated entirely to the scientific study of consciousness. The room is modest, filled with instruments that seem strange to modern eyes, metronomes clicking out precise intervals, devices for measuring reaction time, apparatus for studying visual perception. Wundt sits at a desk covered with careful notations, recording the introspections of trained observers who attempt to break down their conscious experience into its most basic elements, sensations, feelings, images. He calls this approach structuralism, the attempt to map the structure of consciousness, just as a chemist might analyze a compound into its constituent elements. His students learn to observe their own mental processes with rigorous discipline, describing the exact quality of a sound, the precise nature of a visual sensation, stripping away interpretation and meaning to reach the raw data of experience. The work is painstaking, meticulous, each experiment repeated dozens of times, each observation carefully recorded. Wundt believes that through this systematic introspection, psychology can become a true science, objective and empirical. He trains students who will carry this vision across Europe and America, spreading the gospel of experimental psychology, establishing laboratories in universities that had never before considered the mind a fit subject for scientific inquiry. But even as Wundt's laboratory thrives, voices of dissent emerge. William James, working across the Atlantic at Harvard, finds the structuralist approach too narrow, too artificial. He argues that consciousness is not a collection of static elements, but a flowing stream, constantly moving, constantly changing, never the same from one moment to the next. James publishes The Principles of Psychology in 1890, a massive 2-volume work that reads more like literature than science, filled with vivid descriptions and philosophical insights. He writes about the stream of consciousness, about habit as the enormous flywheel of society, about emotions arising from bodily changes rather than causing them. We do not run because we are afraid, he suggests. We are afraid because we run, the physical response creating the emotional experience. His approach, which comes to be called functionalism, asks not what consciousness is made of, but what it does, how it helps organisms adapt to their environment. This evolutionary perspective, influenced by Darwin's recent work, shifts psychology's focus toward purpose and utility, toward understanding the mind as a tool shaped by natural selection. Across the ocean in Vienna, another revolution is beginning, one that will shake the foundations of respectable society, challenge comfortable assumptions about human nature. Sigmund Freud, trained as a neurologist, begins listening to patients whose symptoms defy medical explanation, women who cannot walk despite having no physical injury, who suffer paralysis that appears and disappears without anatomical cause. Working with Joseph Breuer, Freud explores the possibility that these symptoms have psychological origins, that trauma and conflict, pushed out of awareness, continue to exert to influence from beneath the surface of consciousness. he develops the method he calls psychoanalysis, inviting patients to recline on a couch and speak freely, following the associative threads of their thoughts wherever they might lead. What emerges from these sessions astounds him. Patients speak of childhood experiences they had forgotten, of wishes and desires they had never consciously acknowledged, of dreams filled with symbolic meaning. Freud begins to map what he calls the unconscious, a vast territory of mental life existing beyond awareness, yet profoundly shaping behavior, emotion, even physical symptoms. His theory grows increasingly complex. He proposes that the mind is divided into id, ego, and superego, primitive desires held in check by internalized moral standards, mediated by the rational ego, attempting to navigate reality. He suggests that childhood experiences, particularly those involving sexuality and aggression, leave lasting imprints on personality. That development proceeds through stages: oral, anal, phallic, each with its own challenges and potential conflicts. The ideas are scandalous. Victorian society recoils at the suggestion that children have sexual feelings, that respectable people harbor unconscious wishes they would consciously reject. Yet Freud's theories spread rapidly, captivating artists and intellectuals, inspiring both devoted followers and fierce critics. Psychoanalysis becomes not just a therapy, but a cultural phenomenon, a lens through which to interpret art, literature, civilization itself. We move through a series of connecting rooms now, each room representing a different response to Freud's provocative ideas. Here is Alfred Adler, who breaks with Freud to emphasize the drive for superiority, the compensations we make for feelings of inferiority, the importance of social interest and community feeling. There is Carl Jung, Freud's chosen heir until their bitter split. Jung proposes a collective unconscious shared by all humanity, populated by archetypes, universal symbols and patterns that appear in myths and dreams across cultures: the shadow, the anima and animus, the wise old man, the great mother. He sees the psyche as naturally inclined toward wholeness, toward what he calls individuation, the integration of conscious and unconscious into a complete self. In a corner sits Karen Horney, challenging Freud's theories about women, arguing that what he called penis envy reflected not biological destiny, but the real social powerlessness of women in patriarchal society. She develops her own theory of neurosis, emphasizing the role of anxiety and the strategies we develop to cope with it, moving toward people, against people, or away from people. Meanwhile, in America, a different revolution is brewing, one that will reject both structuralism's introspection and psychoanalysis's unconscious speculation. John Watson, impatient with invisible mental processes, declares that psychology should study only observable behavior, measurable responses to measurable stimuli. His manifesto appears in 1913. Psychology as the behaviorist views it. He argues that consciousness is neither accessible nor relevant, that psychology's proper subject is behavior, pure and simple. Give him any healthy infant, he famously claims, and he can train that child to become anything: doctor, lawyer, thief, regardless of talents or tendencies. Through proper conditioning, Watson demonstrates his principles with the infamous Little Albert experiment, conditioning an infant to fear a white rat by pairing its appearance with a loud, frightening noise. The child's fear generalizes to other furry objects. showing how emotions can be learned through association. The experiment is ethically troubling, even by the standards of its time, yet it establishes behaviorism's power to shape psychology for decades to come. B.F. Skinner carries this approach further, developing the concept of operant conditioning, showing how behavior is shaped by its consequences. Rewards strengthen behavior, making it more likely to recur. Punishments weaken it. Animals in his carefully designed boxes, pressing levers for food pellets, demonstrate principles that Skinner believes govern all behavior, human and animal alike. He envisions a technology of behavior, methods for designing environments that shape people toward productivity, cooperation, happiness. His novel, Walden 2, describes a utopian community organized around behavioral principles. His critics see a dystopian nightmare, the reduction of human freedom to mechanical stimulus and response. Yet his influence spreads through education, therapy, animal training. Anywhere behavior needs to be modified or understood, but not everyone accepts this radical rejection of mental life. In Europe, a different approach emerges: Gestalt psychology, founded by Max Wertheimer, Kurt Koffka, and Wolfgang Kohler. These researchers argue that perception is not built up from simple sensations, but organized into meaningful wholes. The whole is different from the sum of its parts. They insist. We see patterns, figures, relationships, not collections of isolated elements. Their demonstrations are elegant and compelling. The five phenomenon, showing how separate lights flashing in sequence create the perception of movement. Figure ground organization, revealing how the same image can be seen as either vase or faces, never both simultaneously. These insights challenge both structuralism's elementalism and behaviorism's disregard for perception and thought. As the 20th century progresses, psychology multiplies into distinct schools, approaches, specializations. Developmental psychologists observe children, mapping the stages through which thinking and morality evolve. Jean Piaget in Switzerland watches his own children with meticulous attention, documenting how they construct understanding through interaction with the world, moving from sensor a motor intelligence through concrete operations to abstract thought. Social psychologists design experiments revealing the power of situations to override individual character. Solomon Asch shows how people will deny the evidence of their own eyes to conform to group opinion. Stanley Milgram demonstrates that ordinary individuals will administer what they believe are dangerous electric shocks when ordered by an authority figure. These findings disturb comfortable assumptions about human autonomy and moral judgment. Clinical psychologists develop new approaches to treatment. Carl Rogers pioneers client-centered therapy, trusting in the individual's capacity for growth and self-direction, offering unconditional positive regard, empathic understanding, genuineness, creating a relationship in which healing can naturally occur. His approach stands in stark contrast to the analyst's interpretive authority, the behaviorist's external control. Abraham Maslow and others develop humanistic psychology, rejecting both psychoanalysis's focus on pathology and behaviorism's mechanistic view. They emphasize human potential, creativity, self-actualization, the highest reaches of human experience, peak moments of transcendence and unity. Maslow proposes his famous hierarchy of needs, from basic physiological requirements through safety, belonging, esteem, to self-actualization at the pyramid's peak. The mansion has grown vast now, its corridors branching in every direction, laboratories humming with experiments, clinics where therapists listen to stories of suffering and hope, libraries filled with competing theories. Each room represents a different way of understanding the psyche, a different set of questions, a different method of seeking answers. We pause in this maze of possibilities, sensing the richness and confusion, the creativity and conflict. Psychology has become many psychologies, united more by their common subject than by shared assumptions or methods. The questions the ancient philosophers asked remain, but now they are pursued with precision instruments, statistical analyses, carefully controlled experiments, systematic observation. The middle decades of the 20th century bring new technologies, new ways of peering into the mind's operations. The development of the electroencephalogram allows researchers to record the brain's electrical activity, to see patterns of waves that shift with sleep and waking, with attention and relaxation. Neuroscience begins its slow convergence with psychology, bridging the gap Descartes had opened centuries before. In the 1950s, a revolution begins quietly, almost unnoticed at first. Researchers studying memory and attention find behaviorism's restrictions increasingly frustrating. How can we understand language without considering mental representations? How can we explain problem solving without acknowledging thought processes? The computer, newly invented, offers a compelling metaphor. Perhaps the mind processes information like a machine, taking input, transforming it through various operations, producing output. George Miller publishes his famous paper on the magical number 7 plus or minus 2, demonstrating that working memory has strict capacity limits, that we can hold only a handful of items in conscious awareness at once. His work combines rigorous experimentation with theoretical models of mental processing, helping to launch what becomes known as the cognitive revolution. Ulrich Neisser gives this movement its name with his book Cognitive Psychology in 1967. The tide turns decisively. Psychologists once again feel free to study mental processes, to build models of attention, memory, reasoning, perception. But unlike the introspectionists, they rely on objective measures, reaction times, error patterns, systematic variations in experimental conditions. The mind remains invisible, but its operations leave traces that can be measured and analyzed. Jerome Bruner and others explore cognitive development, building on Piaget's insights, but emphasizing the role of culture and education. They show how scaffolding, structured support from more knowledgeable others, helps children extend their capabilities, master new domains. Language becomes central to cognitive psychology. Noam Chomsky's devastating critique of the Skinner's account of language acquisition demonstrates that children must bring innate capacities to the task, that they could not possibly learn grammar from simple reinforcement, that something deeper, some universal grammar, must guide linguistic development. The study of emotion, long neglected, begins to flourish. Stanley Schachter proposes that emotions require both physiological arousal and cognitive interpretation, that the same racing heart might be experienced as fear or excitement depending on how we understand our situation. Paul Ekman travels to remote cultures, showing photographs of faces to people who have never encountered Western media, discovering that certain emotional expressions, happiness, sadness, fear, anger, disgust, surprise, are recognized across all cultures, suggesting evolutionary foundations for emotional communication. In the realm of social psychology, researchers continue to reveal the hidden influences on behavior and judgment. Leon Festinger introduces cognitive dissonance theory, showing how people change their attitudes to reduce the uncomfortable tension that arises when their actions conflict with their beliefs. Philip Zimbardo's Stanford Prison Experiment, later controversial for its ethics, demonstrates how quickly normal students adopt brutal or submissive behaviors when assigned roles as guards or prisoners, revealing the terrifying power of social roles and situations. Clinical psychology expands its repertoire. Aronbeck develops cognitive therapy, showing that depression often involves distorted thinking patterns, automatic negative thoughts that color interpretation of events. By teaching patients to recognize and challenge these thoughts, to test their validity against evidence, therapy can produce lasting changes in mood and behavior. His approach, empirically validated through controlled trials, offers an alternative to both psychoanalytic and purely behavioral treatments. Albert Ellis pioneers rational emotive behavior therapy, emphasizing that emotional disturbance stems from irrational beliefs, from absolutist demands we place on ourselves and the world, must, should, ought. By disputing these beliefs, by adopting more flexible and realistic attitudes, people can reduce their suffering and live more effectively. The 1870s through 1970s see psychology establish itself as a very diverse discipline, with specialized journals, professional organizations, training programs, licensure requirements. It becomes simultaneously more scientific and more fragmented. Biological psychologists study neurotransmitters and brain structures. Developmental psychologists track changes across the lifespan. Industrial organizational psychologists apply psychological principles to workplace problems. Educational psychologists design better teaching methods. Health psychologists explore connections between mind and body, stress and illness, behavior and wellness. Cross-cultural psychology emerges, challenging assumptions that findings from Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic societies, the so-called weird populations, apply universally. Researchers discover both universals and profound cultural variations in cognition, emotion, motivation, moral reasoning. The collectivist values of many Asian cultures produce different patterns of attribution and self-concept than the individualism dominant in the West. Feminist psychologists critique the male bias in much psychological research and theory. Carol Gilligan challenges Lawrence Kohlberg's stages of moral development, arguing that they reflect a masculine emphasis on justice and rights while devaluing the feminine ethic of care and relationship. Mary Ainsworth develops the strange situation procedure, revealing different attachment patterns between infants and caregivers, showing how early relationships shape expectations and behaviors in later life. As the 20th century enters its final decades, neuroscience advances accelerate. The development of functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, allows researchers to watch the living brain at work, to see which regions activate during different tasks, when remembering, when experiencing emotion, when making moral judgments. The images are beautiful, colored maps of neural activity, but interpretation requires care. Correlation does not establish causation, and the brain's complexity resists simple mapping of functions to locations. Evolutionary psychology gains prominence, applying Darwin's principles to understanding the mind. David Buss and others argue that many psychological mechanisms, from mate preferences to fears to cognitive biases, reflect adaptations shaped by natural selection, solving recurrent problems faced by our ancestors. Critics worry about genetic determinism, about just-so stories that explain everything but predict nothing, yet the evolutionary perspective provides coherent explanations for phenomena that otherwise seem arbitrary or puzzling. Positive psychology emerges as a movement in the late 1990s. Martin Seligman and others argue that psychology has focused too heavily on pathology, on what goes wrong, and should devote equal attention to what makes life worth living, to strengths and virtues, to flourishing and well-being. Research explores gratitude, resilience, meaning, flow states, character, strengths. The movement attracts both enthusiasm and skepticism, praised for balancing psychology's focus, criticized for ignoring structural inequalities, and sometimes promoting a kind of mandatory happiness. The 21st century brings new challenges and opportunities. The replication crisis shakes psychology's confidence. Many classic findings fail to replicate in large, well-powered studies. The field engages in painful self-examination, adopting more rigorous statistical practices, pre-registration of studies, open sharing of data. Recognition grows that publication bias, the tendency to publish only positive results, has distorted the literature, created false confidence in fragile findings. Mental health treatment continues to evolve. Evidence-based practices become the standard, requiring that interventions demonstrate effectiveness through controlled research. Dialectical behavior therapy, combining cognitive behavioral techniques with mindfulness and acceptance, proves effective for borderline personality disorder, previously considered nearly untreatable. Exposure therapy helped people overcome phobias and post-traumatic stress, gradually confronting feared situations until anxiety diminishes. The conversation around mental health itself transforms. Advocacy reduces stigma. Public figures speak openly about depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder. The diagnostic categories themselves come under scrutiny. Are they discrete diseases or points on continua? Do they reflect biological reality or social construction? The answers remain contested, but the questions themselves reveal psychology's maturation, its willingness to examine its own foundations. Technology creates new domains for psychological study, social media's effects on well-being and social comparison, video games' influence on attention and aggression, smartphones' impact on memory and concentration, virtual reality's potential for therapy and training. These phenomena would have been unimaginable to Wundt or James. Yet psychologists study them with tools and theories descended from those pioneers' work. Cultural awareness deepens. Recognition grows that psychological theories developed in Western contexts may not apply universally. That diagnosis must account for cultural expressions of distress. That treatment must respect diverse worldviews and values. Indigenous psychologies develop in various cultures. integrating traditional healing practices with contemporary psychological understanding, trauma becomes better understood. Bessel van der Kolk and others show how traumatic experiences are encoded differently than ordinary memories, how they can fragment and persist, intruding unbidden into consciousness. They develop treatments that work through the body as well as the mind, recognizing that trauma leaves traces in muscle tension, breathing patterns, autonomic nervous system activation. We find ourselves now in the mansion's newer wings, rooms still being furnished, questions still being formulated. The journey from ancient philosophy to contemporary neuroscience has been long and winding, marked by false starts and genuine discoveries, by brilliant insights and embarrassing errors, by helping and harm done in psychology's name. The field has grown too vast for any single person to master, too diverse in its methods and assumptions to speak with one voice. And yet, beneath this multiplicity, certain continuities persist: the desire to understand, to alleviate suffering, to map the invisible territory of subjective experience, to find patterns in the chaos of human behavior and emotion. As we move toward the mansion's quieter chambers, where reflection deepens and broader patterns emerge, we carry with us this history, this accumulation of questions asked and partially answered, of methods developed and refined, of countless individuals who devoted themselves to understanding the mind, that most intimate and mysterious aspect of our existence. The quiet chambers we enter now are lit differently, softer, more contemplative. Here the individual threads of psychology's history weave together into larger patterns, revealing themes that transcend any single theory or era, connections that span centuries and cross disciplinary boundaries. We settle into a window seat overlooking gardens that shift and change as we watch, representing the plasticity at the heart of human nature, the remarkable capacity for transformation that psychology has documented again and again. The brain we are born with is not the brain we die with. Neural pathways strengthen with use, weaken with neglect. Experiences literally reshape our biology, just as our biology shapes what experiences we seek and how we interpret them. This neuroplasticity, discovered gradually through patient observation and careful experiment, overturns older notions of fixed personality, predetermined fate. It offers hope for recovery from injury, for change after trauma, for growth throughout the lifespan. The child neglected can learn secure attachment. The adult paralyzed by anxiety can discover courage. The elderly mind can form new memories, create new connections, though perhaps more slowly than in youth. And yet, plasticity has its limits, windows that open and close. Critical periods exist when certain capacities must be developed, or they may never fully emerge. Language acquisition comes easily to children, becomes increasingly difficult for adults. Early sensory deprivation can permanently impair perception. The brain is neither infinitely flexible nor rigidly determined, but something more complex, shaped by the interplay of genes and environment, biology and experience, nature and nurture, dancing together in patterns too intricate to fully untangle. We turn from the window to notice the room's shelves, lined with journals and case studies, each representing a life, a story of struggle and resilience, of suffering and healing, or sometimes of suffering that persists despite the best efforts of patient and therapist alike. Psychology deals in probabilities, not certainties, in tendencies, not laws. The same treatment helps one person and fails another. The same childhood produces a poet and a criminal, siblings raised together who could hardly be more different. This irreducible individuality humbles psychology's scientific ambitions, reminds us that beneath all theories and diagnoses, beneath all statistical averages and experimental findings, there exist unique human beings, each carrying their own constellation of memories and meanings, fears and hopes, wounds and strengths. The art of psychology lies in holding together the general and the particular, the patterns revealed by research, and the singular person sitting across from us, asking for help, seeking understanding. The walls here are hung with images, brain scans showing regions that light up with activity, genetic sequences associated with temperament, graphs tracking mood across days and weeks. These objective measures have taught us much, revealed connections we could not otherwise see. Yet something always escapes measurement: the quality of experience, the felt sense of being this particular person at this particular moment. Consciousness remains somehow irreducible, resistant to complete explanation in neural terms. This explanatory gap, sometimes called the hard problem of consciousness, echoes the ancient mind-body problem in modern form. We can correlate brain states with mental states, can even predict thoughts from neural activity patterns, and yet the question persists: why is there something it is like to be me? Why does electrical and chemical signaling in the brain give rise to the felt texture of experience, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the subjective presence that makes me not just an information processing system, but a conscious being? Perhaps this mystery will yield to future neuroscience. Perhaps consciousness will be explained as an emergent property of complex neural networks. Or perhaps, as some philosophers suggest, consciousness is fundamental, irreducible to anything simpler, woven into the fabric of reality itself. Psychology need not solve this metaphysical puzzle to continue its practical work, but the puzzle reminds us of how much remains unknown, how vast the territory we have barely begun to explore. In a corner of the room sits a collection of letters, correspondence between patients and therapists, between researchers separated by continents, between rivals who disagreed profoundly, yet respected each other's dedication to truth. These letters speak of relationships, the connecting thread that runs through every aspect of psychology. We are fundamentally social creatures, shaped by our attachments, defined by our connections. The infant who bonds securely with caregivers develops trust. The child who experiences consistent attunement learns emotional regulation. The adult who maintains meaningful relationships lives longer, healthier, happier. Loneliness, researchers have discovered, is not merely unpleasant, but dangerous, as harmful to health as smoking, as predictive of early death as obesity. We need each other not as luxury, but as necessity. Our brains evolved in social groups, developed capacities for reading faces, inferring intentions, cooperating and competing, empathizing and manipulating. Much of our cognitive architecture serves social functions, helps us navigate the complex web of relationships that constitute human life, and yet we are also separate, bounded by skin and skull, ultimately alone in our subjectivity. This tension between connection and isolation, between self and other, between autonomy and belonging, appears again and again in psychological theory, in existential anxiety, in the adolescent struggle for identity, in the lifelong negotiation between individual needs and social demands. The room has grown dimmer now, the light outside fading toward evening. We rise from the window seat and move toward the final doorway, sensing that our time in this mansion is drawing to a close. Behind us lies the accumulated wisdom of centuries, the patient observations, the bold theories, the careful experiments, the clinical insights, the methodological debates, all of it representing humanity's sustained effort to know itself, to understand the invisible processes that make us who we are. Psychology has not solved the mystery of human nature. Perhaps it never will. The mind is too complex, too context-dependent, too shaped by culture and history and individual circumstance to be captured in a final theory, a complete explanation. And yet, the effort itself has value, has produced genuine knowledge, genuine help for genuine suffering, treatments that work, insights that illuminate, frameworks that organize experience and suggest paths forward. We pass through the doorway into a gallery hung with portraits, but these are not historical figures. These are the faces of ordinary people who have been helped, who found in psychology resources for healing, for growth, for understanding. The woman who learned that her intrusive thoughts did not make her dangerous. The man who discovered that his father's criticism need not define his worth. The child whose learning disability was recognized and accommodated. The couple who learned to communicate beneath their arguments, to hear the longing beneath the blame. These faces remind us why the mansion was built, why researchers spend years pursuing questions that may never be fully answered, why therapists sit with suffering day after day, listening, witnessing, offering the patient presence that creates space for change. Psychology serves not just knowledge but human flourishing, not just understanding but relief of distress. The theoretical and the practical, the scientific and the humane, intertwine like the double helix, each incomplete without the other. We move slowly now, savoring these final moments in the mansion. We have traveled from ancient Greece to contemporary neuroscience, from philosophy to laboratory, from asylum to clinic, seen the mind conceptualized as soul, as mechanism, as information processor, as evolved adaptation, as social construction. Each view captures something real. Each misses something important. The truth, if there is a singular truth, lies somewhere in the integration, in holding multiple perspectives simultaneously, in recognizing that human beings are simultaneously biological organisms, information processors, social creatures, meaning makers, agents and objects, free and determined. The gallery opens onto a final room, nearly empty, containing only a simple chair facing a large window. Outside, darkness has almost completely fallen. A few stars begin to appear, distant points of light against the vast unknown. We settle into the chair, feeling the weight of all we have seen and heard, all the ideas and discoveries, all the suffering and healing, all the questions asked across millennia. This chair invites rest, reflection, a letting go of the need to know, to understand, to master. Psychology has taught us much about the mind, and yet the mind contemplating psychology remains somehow beyond its own grasp. The eye cannot see itself. The hand cannot grasp itself. Consciousness cannot step outside itself to view itself objectively. There is always this irreducible first-person perspective, this being here, this experiencing subject that can be studied but never fully objectified. And perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps some mystery should remain, some wonder that resists reduction to mechanism, some sacredness in the simple fact of being, of feeling, of knowing that we are. The stars outside grow brighter as darkness deepens, each one a distant sun, unreachable, beautiful. We watch them in silence, our breathing slowing, our thoughts growing quieter, less urgent. The mansion has shared its treasures, opened its rooms, revealed its accumulated wisdom. But the deepest knowing comes not from facts and theories, but from this quiet presence, this simple awareness, this being here, now, watching stars emerge, feeling breath rise and fall, noticing thoughts arise and pass, like clouds across an empty sky. Outside, the night is vast. The stars continue their ancient patterns, wheeling slowly across the darkness. Inside, the chair holds us gently. The window reflects our own face, faint, almost transparent, superimposed over the night sky. We see ourselves and the stars simultaneously, inner and outer, subject and object, the watcher and the watched, all part of one continuous whole. The boundary between self and world grows permeable, less distinct. We are not separate from what we observe, but part of it. The mind studying itself, consciousness, aware of consciousness, the universe knowing like itself through these temporary forms, these brief coalescences of a matter and energy that look out and wonder, that ask questions and seek meaning, that suffer and love and eventually dissolve back into the elements from which they came. Our eyes grow heavy, the stars blur slightly, soften, the room around us fades into shadow. All the theories and debates, all the schools and approaches, all the careful distinctions and passionate arguments settle like dust. Everything we have learned becomes quiet, becomes distant, becomes part of the vast tapestry of knowing and not knowing that constitutes this strange adventure of being human. The last light fades from the window, the stars remain, distant, constant. We rest in this chair, in this room, in this mansion built of questions and partial answers. The journey complete, the story told. Nothing left but this peaceful darkness, this gentle fading, this soft return to the mystery from which all knowing emerges, and to which it all eventually returns. There is a certain kind of quiet that lives inside music, not the silence between notes, but something deeper, the held breath before a melody begins, the vast, unhurried stillness that seems to gather in the air just before sound takes shape. It is that kind of quiet that drifts through these thoughts tonight, a soft, wondering quality, as if the mind has slowed enough to hear something it usually rushes past. Imagine standing in a grand hall, not any particular hall, but a composite of all such places that have ever existed, stone floors worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, tall windows through which the last of the evening light falls in long amber columns, dust suspended in the air like tiny golden planets, each one perfectly still. The walls are lined with portraits, faces from other centuries gazing outward with expressions that are neither stern nor smiling, but simply present, watchful in the way that old things tend to be watchful, as if they have long since decided that patience is the truest form of knowledge. At the far end of the hall there is a harpsichord, its lacquered surface reflecting the candlelight in long, wavering ribbons. The keys yellowed slightly at the edges, the way old ivory tends to yellow, not from neglect, but from use, from the accumulated warmth of thousands of hands that have pressed down upon them over the years, drawing out their thin, bright voices. And there is something in the sight of that instrument, just sitting there, silent, patient, that opens a door in the mind, a door that leads not forward into the next moment, but sideways into the long, slow river of time. This is the world of the great composers, not the world as it appears in concert programs and encyclopedias, not the dates and opus numbers and formal dedications to patrons long since forgotten, but the living world, the world of cold mornings and guttering candles, of ink-stained fingers and manuscripts spread across uneven wooden tables, of whole lifetimes spent in pursuit of something that could never quite be written down fast enough. It is a world that stretches back further than most people imagine, winding through centuries and across an entire continent, threading its way through courts and cathedrals, through the small lamplit rooms of the deeply poor and the vast gilded chambers of the extravagantly wealthy, through revolution and plague and war and an almost unbearable beauty that somehow persisted through all of it. The story of the great composers is not a single story at all. It is more like a great river system, dozens of tributaries flowing into one another, merging and diverging, running fast in certain stretches and then slowing into something wide and contemplative before speeding up again around the next bend. There are names that even those who know little about music will recognize, names that have passed so thoroughly into the fabric of common knowledge that they feel almost mythological. Beethoven, Bach, Mozart, figures so large in the cultural imagination that it can be difficult to remember they were simply people who woke in the mornings uncertain of what the day would bring, people who quarreled and doubted and made mistakes, and sometimes wrote music so transcendent that it seems to belong not to any single human life, but to something vaster and less easily named. And then there are the others, the composers who lived and worked and left behind extraordinary things and yet exist today in a kind of historical shadow. Hildegard von Bingen, composing her luminous sacred melodies in a 12th century German abbey. Claudio Monteverdi, standing at the edge of an entirely new musical world and stepping deliberately into it. George Frederick Handel, filling London's concert halls with sound so rich and ceremonial that a king once rose to his feet and by doing so started a tradition that has persisted for nearly 300 years. These names, the celebrated and the lesser known alike, are part of the same long unfolding, the same gradual centuries-long process of discovery and refinement and reinvention that gave us the music that still drifts out of open windows on summer evenings and fills the darkened interiors of concert halls and plays softly in the background of ordinary moments that somehow become, in retrospect, unforgettable. To think about the great composers is to think about time itself in a particular way, about the strange way that certain things persist while others vanish, about what it means to make something that outlasts the maker by centuries, by half a millennium in some cases, the ink still legible, the notes still singable, the emotions still remarkably, mysteriously intact. There is something in that persistence that invites a kind of slow, wondering attention, a willingness to linger over details, to follow a thread not because it leads somewhere urgent, but because the thread itself is beautiful and the following of it is its own reward. The harpsichord at the end of the hall is still silent, but it is a different kind of silence now, a silence full of implication, full of all the music that has ever been drawn from instruments like it, and all the music that might yet come. The amber light through the windows has deepened slightly, moving toward that particular shade of gold that belongs to the hour just before the sky begins its long descent into blue. And somewhere in that golden air something begins to stir. Not sound exactly, but the memory of sound, or perhaps the anticipation of it, the sense that the long, quiet hall is simply waiting for the right moment to become once again alive with music. Let that sense settle. Let it spread slowly through the mind, the way warmth spreads through a room when a fire is lit for the first time on a cold evening. Because this is where the story begins, not with a dramatic entrance or a moment of sudden clarity, but with exactly this: a hall, a harpsichord, a quality of light, and a willingness to be still long enough to let the past come drifting gently forward. The great composers are gathering, unhurried, from every corner of the centuries, and all that is required is to remain here, in this soft and golden quiet, and listen as their stories slowly begin to unfold. The story does not begin where most people expect it to begin. It does not begin with the grand orchestras or the towering symphonies or the names carved into the marble facades of opera houses. It begins much earlier than that, in places that were less about performance and more about devotion, less about entertainment and more about the attempt to reach something sacred through the organized beauty of sound. It begins, in many ways, in the early medieval monasteries of Europe, those quiet, stone-walled communities where the days were measured not by clocks, but by prayer, by the canonical hours that divided each day into intervals of worship and work and contemplative silence. In these places, music was not yet what we would recognize as music. It was something older and more austere, a single melodic line, unharmonized, moving through the air of a cold stone chapel, like a thread of smoke rising from a candle. This was plainchant, known also as Gregorian chant after Pope Gregory I, who, according to tradition, played a significant role in its codification around the end of the 6th century. Though scholars today understand that the music itself evolved gradually over a much longer period, shaped by many hands and many voices across the span of several centuries, the chant was modal, meaning it operated according to systems of scale and melody that feel unfamiliar to ears trained on modern Western music. There is a floating quality to it, a sense of music that does not resolve in the way we have come to expect, that does not reach for a home note and then settle into it with the comfortable finality of a door clicking shut. Instead, it moves, it wanders purposefully, and in that wandering there is something deeply meditative, something that seems to slow the passage of time rather than mark it. And it was within this tradition, this centuries-long practice of sacred monophonic song, that the first recognizable figure in the history of Western composition emerges from the shadows of history with a voice distinct enough to be called, without hesitation, her own. Her name was Hildegard von Bingen, born in the year 1108 in the Rhineland region of what is now Germany, the 10th child of a noble family who, following the custom of the time, offered her to the church as a kind of spiritual tithe when she was just 8 years old. She spent her early years under the guidance of a woman named Jutta of Sponheim, learning the Psalter and the life of prayer in a small anchorage attached to the monastery of Disi-Bodenberg. And when Jutta died in 1136, Hildegard was chosen by the women in her community to lead them. But what makes Hildegard extraordinary, what lifts her from the historical record as something more than a capable abbess and religious administrator, is the music. From a relatively early age, Hildegard reported experiencing visions, luminous, overwhelming encounters with what she described as the living light, and she was commanded, she believed, to write down what she saw and heard, not merely to record her theological insights, but to transmit the music that seemed to come to her whole and fully formed from somewhere beyond her ordinary mind. Her compositions, gathered into a cycle, she called the Symphonia Harmoni Celestium Revelationum, which might be translated as the Symphony of the Harmony of Celestial Revelations, are unlike anything else from the 12th century. They are expansive where plainchant is restrained, soaring where the tradition counsels measured simplicity. The melodic lines climb to ranges that push the limits of what the human voice can comfortably sustain, as if straining toward the very source from which they came. There is in Hildegard's music a quality that is genuinely difficult to name, a kind of radiant strangeness, something that feels simultaneously ancient and immediate, as if it belongs not to the 12th century specifically, but to some other, less clearly bounded kind of time. She lived until the age of 81, a remarkable span for the medieval period, continuing to compose and write and correspond with popes and emperors and abbots from across Europe. And when she died in 1179, she left behind a body of work that would eventually, many centuries later, be recognized as foundational. But in the centuries immediately following her death, the music of the great composers, or rather the tradition that would eventually give rise to them, was changing in ways that were subtle at first and then quite suddenly transformative. The great shift was polyphony, the addition of a second voice to the single melodic line of plainchant, and then a third, and then a fourth, voices weaving around one another in a texture of simultaneous sound that opened up dimensions of musical experience that the solitary melodic line had never been able to explore. The early experiments in polyphony were cautious, even awkward by later standards. The added voices moving in stiff parallel motion, like shadows following an original at a fixed distance. But gradually, over the course of the 12th and 13th centuries, something loosened. The voices began to move independently, to cross one another, to create moments of dissonance, and then, crucially, to resolve those moments into consonance with an effect that was not merely pleasant, but deeply, almost physically satisfying. The center of this development was the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, and the two composers most closely associated with its flowering are known to us only as Léonin and Perrotin. Their full names, their birth dates, the details of their lives, all of this is largely lost to us. They exist in the historical record more as names attached to innovations than as fully rounded human beings. But the innovations themselves are real and lasting. Léonin's Magnus Liber Organi, the great book of organum, represented a systematic and sophisticated approach to polyphonic composition that would influence generations of musicians to come. And Perrotin, who came after him and revised his work, pushed the texture further, writing in 3 and 4 simultaneous voices with a rhythmic complexity that was genuinely new in the world. Listening to Perrotin's Viderunt omnes today, a 4-voice setting of a Gregorian chant that was performed at Notre Dame on the first day of January in the year 1208, is to encounter something that feels both archaic and astonishing. The long, sustained notes of the original chant in the lowest voice, holding steady for what seem like impossible lengths, while 3 upper voices weave an intricate shimmering pattern above it, the whole structure rising and falling with the slow grandeur of something geological. The centuries continued to turn, and the music continued to change. The 14th century brought with it a figure who stands at a significant crossroads in the history of Western music. Guillaume de Machaut, a French poet and composer who was born around 1300 and who lived through some of the most catastrophic events of the medieval period, including the Black Death, which swept across Europe between 1347 and 1351 and killed, by some estimates, between 30 and 60% of the continent's population. Machaut survived, and he continued to compose prolifically even as the world around him fell apart in ways that must have seemed almost incomprehensible to those living through it. He was a churchman, a canon at the Cathedral of Reims, but his music was not exclusively sacred. He wrote secular songs, polyphonic ballades and rondeaux, and virelais, works of considerable elegance and emotional range that spoke not to the eternal and the divine, but to the immediate and the human, to love and longing and the peculiar pleasures of a courtly life. And he wrote the Messe de Notre Dame, the first complete polyphonic setting of the ordinary of the Mass that can be attributed with confidence to a single composer, a work of 4 voices that represents a kind of threshold moment in the history of music, the point at which the large-scale, multi-movement sacred composition becomes, for the first time, a coherent artistic undertaking rather than a collection of separately composed parts. Machaut lived until around 1377, and in the years that followed his death, the tradition he had helped to shape continued to evolve, spreading outward from France into the broader European world. The 15th century brought a group of composers from the region that is now Belgium and the Netherlands, known collectively as the Franco-Flemish School, who would carry polyphonic composition to heights of technical refinement that still astonish musicians and theorists today. The most significant of these early Flemish masters was Guillaume Dufay, born around 1397, a man who spent much of his career in Italy, working for the powerful families and institutions that made the Italian peninsula the most culturally dynamic region of Europe during this period. Dufay wrote in virtually every genre available to him, masses, motets, chansons, and he did so with a fluency and a warmth that set his work apart from the often austere polyphony of his predecessors. There is in Dufay's music a new kind of lyricism, a sense of the melodic line as something that can be not merely correct, but genuinely beautiful in a way that invites the listener simply to follow it, without any need to understand the theoretical structures that support it. His motet Nuper Rosarum Flores, composed for the consecration of the great Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence in 1436, the cathedral with Brunelleschi's vast dome that still dominates the city's skyline, is built on a structural principle of extraordinary sophistication its four voices organized according to proportions drawn from the dimensions of the cathedral itself, a piece of architecture translated into a piece of music, or perhaps a piece of music that aspires to the condition of architecture. After Dufay came Johannes Ockeghem, and after Ockeghem, Josquin Desprez. Josquin, who was born around 1450 and who died in 1521, is perhaps the first composer in the Western tradition whose music feels consistently, unmistakably personal, who sounds across the full range of his output like himself. He was celebrated in his own lifetime in ways that few composers before him had been. The Italian theorist Pietro Aron wrote of him with an admiration that bordered on reverence. And Martin Luther, who knew something about the power of music, called him the master of the notes, implying that where other composers were mastered by their musical material, Josquin mastered it, bending it to his will rather than being bent by it. There is in Josquin's music a new kind of expressive freedom, a willingness to let the shape of the melody be dictated by the meaning of the words it sets, so that the music rises when the text speaks of elevation and falls when it speaks of descent. That seems almost obvious to us now, but was genuinely revolutionary in its time. He stands at the beginning of something, a long tradition of music in which the interior life of the composer, his doubts, his longings, his grief, his wonder, begins to show through the surface of the notes in ways that are unmistakable. The hall is quieter now, or perhaps it is simply that the quality of the silence has changed, deepened, taken on some of the weight of all these centuries laid gently one upon another. The harpsichord at the far end is still patient, still waiting, but the air around it seems somehow more inhabited than it was before, as if all these names and all these centuries have settled into it like a fragrance, faint but persistent, and faintly, deeply lovely. The amber light has shifted again. It is cooler now, less golden, and the dust motes that drifted so slowly through it seem to have grown still at last, hanging suspended in the dimming air, like musical notes on a page that no one is currently reading. But somewhere in that stillness, another name is forming, another story beginning to move toward the surface of the memory, because the Renaissance is deepening now, and the music is about to change again in ways that will echo forward through every century that follows. That name is Palestrina, Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina, born around 1525 in the small hilltop town of Palestrina, southeast of Rome, a town so thoroughly identified with him that it gave him the surname by which history would remember him. He spent most of his life in Rome, working in the great basilicas and papal institutions that made that city the spiritual and ceremonial center of the Catholic world. And he arrived at precisely the moment when the Church was engaged in one of the most consequential self-examinations in its history. The Council of Trent, which met intermittently between 1545 and 1563, was the Catholic Church's formal response to the Protestant Reformation, a vast, exhausting, decades-long effort to clarify doctrine and reform practice. And among the many things it turned its attention to was the question of music. There were voices within the council that argued church music had become too elaborate, too tangled in its own technical sophistication, that the voices in polyphonic compositions were moving so independently and with such rhythmic complexity that the sacred texts they were meant to illuminate had become unintelligible, buried beneath a web of counterpoint so dense that no listener could follow the words. The story goes, and it is almost certainly embellished, though it contains a truth, that Palestrina composed his Missa Papae Marcelli, the Pope Marcellus Mass, as a demonstration that polyphony could be written in a way that preserved the clarity of the text, that the voices could move in their independent interweaving lines without sacrificing the intelligibility that the council demanded. Whether or not that specific legend is accurate in its details, the music itself is undeniably real and undeniably extraordinary. The Missa Papae Marcelli is a piece of 6 voices, and what is remarkable about it is not complexity but clarity, not the density of its counterpoint but the luminous openness of it, the way the voices seem to breathe together, to make room for one another, to create a texture that is simultaneously rich and transparent. There is a kind of serene authority to Palestrina's music, a sense of things being exactly as they should be, not through any effort or straining toward correctness, but through something that feels more like inevitability, as if the notes could not have been arranged in any other order and been so perfectly themselves. He became, in his own lifetime, and even more decisively after his death, the model of what sacred polyphonic composition should be, the gold standard against which generations of later composers would measure themselves, and the study of his style, what theorists would come to call strict counterpoint, or the Palestrina style, became, and in many conservatories remains, one of the foundational exercises of a formal musical education. But while Palestrina was perfecting one kind of music in Rome, something entirely different was stirring in the city of Venice. Venice in the second half of the 16th century was unlike anywhere else in Europe. A city built on water, trading with the entire known world, wealthy and cosmopolitan and deeply proud of its own distinctiveness. A city that did things its own way, including music. The Basilica of San Marco, the great domed Byzantine-inflected church at the heart of the city, had a unique architectural feature that changed the way music was composed and performed within its walls. 2 choir lofts facing one another from opposite sides of the nave, each containing an organ and a choir. This physical arrangement gave rise to a compositional technique that the Venetians called cori spezzati, split choirs, the practice of writing music for 2 or more distinct ensembles that could answer one another across the space of the church, trading melodic phrases back and forth like a conversation, or joining together at moments of climax into a single, overwhelming wall of sound. The great master of this Venetian style was Giovanni Gabrieli, who held the position of principal organist at San Marco from 1585 until his death in 1612, and whose sacred symphonies and canzonas for multiple choirs and instruments represent one of the most spectacular achievements in all of Renaissance music. Gabrieli was among the first composers to write out specific dynamic markings in his scores, instructing performers to play certain passages piano, softly, and others forte, loudly, a practice that seems unremarkable to us now, but was genuinely innovative at the time, a recognition that the expressive range of music extended beyond pitch and rhythm into the dimension of volume itself. And it was one of Gabrieli's students, a young German organist who came to Venice to study and who absorbed everything the Venetian master had to teach, who would carry these ideas northward into the German-speaking world and plant them in soil where they would eventually produce something extraordinary. That student was Heinrich Schütz, born in 1585, and in many ways the most important figure in the history of German music before Johann Sebastian Bach. Schütz spent his career navigating the almost unimaginable difficulties of the 30 Years' War, which tore through the German-speaking lands from 1618 to 1648, with a ferocity and duration that left the region economically devastated and demographically shattered. Some estimates suggest that the German territories lost as much as a third of their population during this period. He continued to compose through it all, adapting, economizing when resources were scarce, writing smaller and more intimate works when the elaborate forces required for his larger pieces could no longer be assembled, and the music that emerged from this long period of difficulty has a quality of hard-won tenderness to it, a depth of feeling that seems inseparable from the suffering that surrounded it. But the tradition that Schütz helped to establish in Germany would reach its culmination, its most complete and overwhelming expression, in the person of a man born in the small Thuringian town of Eisenach on the 21st of March, 1685, Johann Sebastian Bach. The name settles into the air of the hall like a stone settling to the bottom of a very still, very deep pool, sending ripples outward in all directions, slowly, measurably, reaching every shore. Bach was born into a family for whom music was simply the natural medium of existence. The Bach family had been producing musicians for generations before Johann Sebastian arrived, and would continue producing them after, but none of them before or since approached what he achieved. He spent most of his life in relatively modest circumstances, working as a court musician and organist in provincial German towns, Arnstadt, Mühlhausen, Weimar, Köthen, and finally, from 1723 until his death in 1750 as the Thomas Cantor in Leipzig, the director of music at the city's main Lutheran churches, a position of considerable civic importance, but not, by any measure, one of the grandest appointments in the musical world of his time. He was not, during his lifetime, regarded as one of the great figures of European music. He was respected as an organist of formidable skill, and known among specialists for the technical sophistication of his compositions. But the broader musical public of his era was beginning to move in directions that left his elaborate counterpoint sounding, to some ears, old-fashioned. His music was not widely published. Much of it circulated only in manuscript, copied out by hand and passed among a small community of initiates, and when he died, a large portion of his output was simply dispersed, sold off, lost, used as wrapping paper or kindling, the casual indifference of history to even its greatest achievements. And yet what survives is staggering: the well-tempered clavier, 2 sets of 24 preludes and fugues, one in each major and minor key, exploring the full range of harmonic possibility with a comprehensiveness that seems less like composition and more like a complete mapping of a universe. The Mass in B minor, a work of such scope and magnificence that it was never performed in its entirety during Bach's lifetime, assembled from pieces composed across the span of decades, and unified by a vision so coherent it seems impossible that so much time separated its various parts. The Brandenburg Concertos, 6 works for varying instrumental combinations, each one a different solution to the same basic compositional problem, each one so perfect in its solution that the problem seems to disappear entirely, leaving only the music. The Goldberg Variations, an aria followed by 30 variations of such diversity and ingenuity that the whole structure functions less like a piece of music than like a meditation on the nature of identity, on what it means for something to remain itself through every possible transformation. Bach worked every day of his professional life, composing, teaching, performing, copying, raising 20 children with 2 wives, of whom 10 survived to adulthood, managing the daily business of the Leipzig music program, which required him to produce a new cantata for performance in church virtually every week during the liturgical year. He composed over 200 cantatas that have survived. The actual number he wrote was likely higher, possibly around 300, each one a complete, self-contained world of music lasting perhaps 20 minutes, each one written to illuminate a specific text from the Lutheran liturgy for a specific Sunday or feast day. The scale of this output is almost incomprehensible, but perhaps even more incomprehensible than the quantity is the quality, the consistency of invention week after week, year after year, the sense that the pressure of the deadline never diminished the depth of the thought, that the routine of the liturgical calendar somehow generated not repetition but perpetual renewal. And yet Bach worked in deliberate isolation from the other great musical mind of his generation, a man who had been born in the same year in a German town not far from Eisenach, and who had taken his extraordinary gifts in an entirely different direction. George Friedrich Handel, born in Halle in 1685, just 1 month before Bach, was everything that Bach, in worldly terms, was not: cosmopolitan, celebrated, financially successful, a figure who moved easily among the aristocracies of Europe, and who understood with a sure instinct exactly what audiences wanted to hear and how to give it to them. He left Germany as a young man, spent formative years in Italy absorbing the Italian operatic style at its source, and then settled in London, where he remained for the rest of his long life, becoming so thoroughly identified with his adopted country that he was eventually naturalized as a British subject and given a state funeral in Westminster Abbey when he died in 1759. Handel was above all a man of the theatre. His operas, composed in the Italian style for the London stage, occupied the center of his career for decades. Elaborate, expensive productions featuring the greatest singers of the age, works of considerable dramatic sophistication that would eventually fall out of fashion and then, in the 20th century, be rediscovered and celebrated once more. But it is the oratorios that have kept his name alive in the popular imagination, those large-scale sacred works for soloists, chorus, and orchestra that Handel turned to when the economics of Italian opera in London became too uncertain, and which he found, to his own apparent surprise, to be the medium in which his gifts found their most complete expression. The most famous of them needs no introduction: Messiah, composed in the astonishing span of 24 days in August and September of 1741, a work that spans the full arc of Christian theology, from prophecy through incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection to final triumph. The Hallelujah Chorus, at whose first London performance in 1743 King George II reportedly rose to his feet, whether from religious reverence or simply because he had arrived late and was confused, no one can say with certainty, and in rising caused everyone else in the hall to rise as well, establishing by royal precedent a tradition of standing that persists in performances around the world to this day. Handel and Bach, The two great summits of the Baroque era, born in the same year, never meeting, their careers tracing such different paths through the same musical landscape. Bach died in 1750, and Handel followed 9 years later. And with their passing, something that had been building for a century and a half, the great polyphonic tradition of the Baroque, reached its conclusion. But even before they were gone, a new kind of music was already forming in the minds of the next generation, lighter, clearer, more symmetrical, less interested in the elaborate weaving of voices and more interested in the elegant presentation of a single singing melodic line above a simple supporting harmony. The world was changing, and the music, as it always does, was changing with it, preparing to become something that its predecessors could not quite have imagined, and yet, in some essential way, had made possible. The hall seems to breathe very slowly, as if registering the passage of so much time through its patient walls. The new music had a name, or rather it had several names that scholars would later argue over and eventually settle into an uneasy consensus about. But the one that has endured is the classical period, and its great center of gravity in the second half of the 18th century was the city of Vienna. Vienna in those decades was something extraordinary, the capital of the Habsburg Empire, one of the largest and most complex political entities in Europe, a city of palaces and coffee houses, of aristocratic patronage and emerging middle-class culture, a city where music was not merely an ornament to life, but something close to its organizing principle. The new style that was crystallizing in Vienna and in the courts and cities surrounding it was built on different foundations than the Baroque had been, where Bach had woven voices together in textures of almost mathematical density. The new music prized transparency, where the Baroque had moved in long, continuous, forward-pressing phrases. The classical style favored shorter, more balanced structures, phrases that asked a question and then answered it, melodies that departed and then came home. The man most responsible for establishing the formal architecture of this new style, the sonata, the string quartet, the symphony in its mature form, was a composer who was in many ways the least assuming figure imaginable for so consequential a role. Franz Joseph Haydn, born in 1732 in the small Austrian village of Rohrau, the son of a wheelwright, a man of cheerful temperament and remarkable creative longevity, who spent nearly 30 years in the service of the wealthy Esterházy family, living and working at their remote Hungarian estate of Esterháza in a kind of productive isolation that he himself described in retrospect as a gift. Because he was isolated, he told a visitor late in his life, he was forced to be original. He served the Esterházy princes faithfully and inventively for decades, composing symphonies, string quartets, operas, and masses on demand, and in doing so he essentially invented, or at the very least perfected, the forms that would define Western classical music for the next century. His 104 symphonies trace, across the span of his long career, the entire development of the form from its relatively modest early incarnations to the grand, emotionally expansive late works he composed after the death of his patron finally freed him to travel to London, where he was received with a celebrity that astonished him, and where the 12 symphonies he wrote for those visits, the London Symphonies, as they are known, represent some of the finest orchestral music of the entire century. But even as Haydn was doing all of this, even as he was quietly, patiently, systematically building the architecture of classical music from the ground up, there arrived in Vienna a figure so extraordinary that he seemed to belong to a different order of creation entirely. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, born in Salzburg on the 27th of January, 1756, the son of Leopold Mozart, himself a musician and composer of some accomplishment, who recognized almost immediately that the child before him represented something unprecedented. By the time Mozart was 6 years old, he was performing at the courts of Europe, astonishing audiences in Vienna and Paris and London, with a facility at the keyboard that seemed to defy explanation, not merely the mechanical facility of a well-trained child, but something more unsettling, a musicality so complete, so instinctive, that observers struggled to find language for it. He had, according to numerous credible accounts, absolute pitch, the ability to identify and reproduce any note heard without any external reference. And more than that, a capacity for musical memory so extraordinary that at the age of 14 he heard a performance of Allegri's Miserere in the Sistine Chapel, a work whose notation the Vatican kept secret and forbade to be copied, and afterward wrote out the entire piece from memory with virtually no errors. But the prodigy became a composer of a different and deeper kind of greatness, one that had less to do with facility and more to do with understanding, with the ability to find within the elegant formal structures of the classical style a kind of emotional truth that the style itself had not previously seemed capable of containing. His symphonies, and he wrote 41 of them, the last 3 composed in the summer of 1788, within the span of just 6 weeks, move through emotional landscapes of considerable complexity, with a lightness of touch that makes the complexity feel effortless, as if the depth were simply always there, available to anyone willing to listen carefully enough to notice it. His piano concertos, 27 of them, are among the most perfect things in all of music, works in which the relationship between the soloist and the orchestra becomes a kind of drama, an ongoing negotiation between individual voice and collective expression that contains within its formal conventions more genuine feeling than most music manages in far less constrained circumstances. And the operas, The Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, Così fan tutte, The Magic Flute, works that somehow manage to be simultaneously funny and heartbreaking, light and profound, perfectly constructed and overflowing with the kind of spontaneous seeming inspiration that makes listeners feel they are experiencing not a composed artifact, but a living event, but a living. Mozart died in Vienna in 1791 at the age of 35. The cause of his death has been debated for 2 centuries and will probably never be definitively established, and the circumstances of his burial in a common grave, according to the Viennese practice of the time, without ceremony or marker, have given his death a melancholy quality that seems almost too perfectly symbolic to be accidental. But among the mourners at the small ceremony held before his burial was a young composer who had arrived in Vienna from Bonn the previous month, burning with ambition, full of plans to study with Mozart that would now never be realized. His name was Ludwig van Beethoven, and what he would do over the next 4 decades would shake the foundations of everything that had come before. Beethoven was born in Bonn in 1770 into a family troubled by poverty and his father's alcoholism. His early musical education was rigorous and sometimes harsh, his father recognizing the boy's gifts and pushing him with an urgency that had more to do with financial desperation than with genuine pedagogical care. He came to Vienna and studied with Haydn, a relationship that was productive but uneasy, each man somewhat puzzled by the other, and then gradually, in the 1790s, he began to make his name as a pianist of extraordinary power and originality, someone whose playing had a quality of volcanic force that contemporary accounts describe with a consistency that makes the impression feel real across the distance of 2 centuries. And then the hearing began to go. The first signs appeared when Beethoven was in his late 20s, and by his early 30s he was living with the knowledge that he was losing the one sense that his entire life had been built around, the sense without which the life he had made for himself would seem to almost anyone to be impossible to continue. He wrote about it with remarkable candor in a document known as the Heiligenstadt Testament, a letter addressed to his brothers that was found among his papers after his death and never sent, in which he described the despair of his situation and the decision he had made to continue living and working in spite of it. What emerged from that decision was music that could not have been written by anyone who had not passed through such darkness. The Third Symphony, the Eroica, composed in 1803 and 1804, was originally dedicated to Napoleon Bonaparte, in whom Beethoven saw the embodiment of the revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality. And then, when Napoleon declared himself emperor, Beethoven scratched the dedication out so violently that he tore through the paper, a small, furious gesture that speaks volumes about the man and about the convictions he carried with him throughout his life. The Eroica changed everything. It was nearly twice the length of any symphony that had come before it. It moved through emotional states of a complexity and volatility that the classical symphony had never previously attempted, and it announced, as clearly as any musical work has ever announced anything, that a new era had begun. The 9 symphonies that Beethoven wrote over the course of his career trace a journey so comprehensive and so deeply personal that listening to them in sequence feels less like a survey of musical history and more like accompanying a single extraordinary consciousness through the full range of its experience. The Fifth Symphony, with its famous 4-note opening motif, which Beethoven himself reportedly described as fate, knocking at the door, though the attribution is uncertain, building from that single gesture an entire architecture of struggle and eventual triumph. The Sixth Symphony, the Pastoral, a landscape of sound so vivid and so affectionate in its rendering of the natural world that it seems to capture not merely the sights and sounds of the countryside, but the particular quality of attention with which a person deeply in love with the natural world receives it. The Seventh Symphony, which Wagner would later call the apotheosis of the dance, a work of such rhythmic energy and formal inevitability that it seems to be powered by something other than human will. And the Ninth, completed in 1824, by which time Beethoven was completely deaf, a work that ends with a choral finale setting Friedrich Schiller's Ode to Joy, a declaration of universal brotherhood so vast in its ambition and so overwhelming in its execution that it seems to exceed the boundaries of what music was previously understood to be capable of. At the premiere of the Ninth Symphony, Beethoven stood on the stage facing the orchestra, following the score, conducting his own internal version of the piece, while the actual performance took place around him, and he could hear none of it. And when it was over, the audience erupted in an ovation that he could not hear, and it was one of the soloists who came to him and gently turned him around to face the hall so that he could see what he could not hear. The people on their feet, waving their handkerchiefs, overcome. Beethoven died in Vienna in 1827, and the funeral procession drew an estimated 20,000 people into the streets of the city. The Romantic era that followed, built directly on the foundations Beethoven had laid, but it moved in directions that he could not have fully anticipated. Directions shaped by the particular character of the 19th century, with its nationalism and its sentimentality, its cult of the individual artist as a kind of secular prophet, its fascination with nature and with the exotic, its hunger for emotion that was not merely felt, but demonstrably, publicly, overwhelmingly felt. Franz Schubert, who was only 31 years old when Beethoven died, and who would himself die just 18 months later at the age of 31, had already, in his brief life, produced a body of work of staggering richness, over 600 songs alone, plus symphonies, piano sonatas, chamber music, and the unfinished Eighth Symphony, whose 2 movements contain more genuine mystery than most composers manage in a lifetime of complete works. And then there was the generation that came after, Schumann and Chopin, who were born within months of one another in 1810, Liszt, born in 1811, Brahms, born in 1833, and in another tradition that flowed from Germany, but carried its own unmistakable national character, the Russian composers Tchaikovsky, Mussorgsky, Rimsky-Korsakov, who brought the folk melodies and emotional temperament of their vast and ancient country into the concert halls of Europe with an effect that was at first startling and then quickly irresistible. Each of these figures deserves more time than can be given here. Each one a world unto themselves, a complete artistic vision that took decades to develop and that left behind, at the end, a testament to the depths of human feeling that the music of any given century can reach. And the century turned again, as centuries always do, with a mixture of relief and apprehension, carrying with it the accumulated weight of all that had come before and the half-formed sense that something new was approaching, something that would require music to reckon once more with the question it has always been asking in one form or another. What is it exactly that sound can say that no other medium can say quite so completely, quite so directly, quite so irreducibly? The answer to that question has never been fixed. It shifts with each generation, with each new voice that arrives to test the boundaries of what music is and what it can do. And in that shifting, in that perpetual willingness to begin the inquiry again from the beginning, lies perhaps the deepest secret of why the great composers continue to matter, why their music still finds its way to us across the centuries, still lands with something that feels less like information and more like recognition. The hall holds all of this very gently now, the way old stone holds warmth long after the sun has moved past the window and the room has grown dim. There is something worth sitting with for a moment, that persistent question of what music actually does to the people who receive it, because the answer that the great composers seemed to arrive at, each in their own way and each in their own time, was not the answer one might expect. It was not that music communicates emotion in the way that language communicates information, passing a specific content from one mind to another with reasonable fidelity. It was something stranger than that, something that resists the kind of clean summary that language is built to provide. When Chopin sat at the piano in the lamplit drawing rooms of Paris, his fingers moving across the keys with that particular combination of delicacy and force that his contemporaries described with such consistent wonder. What was happening in the room was not simply the transmission of sadness or longing or nostalgia, though all of those things were certainly present. What was happening was closer to the creation of a space, a specific temporary interior architecture that the listener could inhabit, a place that had the proportions of Chopin's own inner world, but that each listener furnished unconsciously with the particular contents of their own. This is perhaps why the same nocturne can mean such different things to different people, and such different things to the same person at different moments in their life. The music is not telling you what to feel. It is opening a room and leaving you in it. And what you find there is always, in some sense, yourself. Brahms understood this. Johannes Brahms, who was born in Hamburg in 1833 and who carried within him a conservatism so profound that it looked to some of his contemporaries like timidity, like an unwillingness to follow where Liszt and Wagner were leading, into music that stretched and strained the old forms until they could no longer contain it. But Brahms's conservatism was not timidity. It was a particular kind of faith, a belief that the forms inherited from Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven were not constraints to be escaped, but vessels capable of holding more than they had yet been asked to hold, that there was still more to be discovered within the boundaries of the symphony and the sonata than the century had yet imagined. His 4 symphonies, the first of which he did not complete and premiere until he was 43 years old, so seriously did he take the responsibility of following in Beethoven's footsteps, are among the most fully inhabited works in the entire orchestral repertoire, music that rewards not the first hearing but the 100th, that gives up its secrets slowly, in layers, over the course of a lifetime of listening. And then there was Wagner, Richard Wagner, born in Leipzig in 1813, is perhaps the most controversial figure in all of music, a man whose personal character was, by virtually every account, deeply unpleasant, vain, manipulative, anti-Semitic, willing to use and discard people with a casual cruelty that appalls even those who love his music, and whose artistic achievement was so immense, so thoroughly transformative, that the history of Western music is cleanly divided into before and after. His music dramas, The Ring Cycle, Tristan und Isolde, Parsifal, reimagined what opera could be, discarding the Italian convention of separate arias and recitatives in favor of an unbroken, continuously evolving musical fabric, a texture he called endless melody that moves and shifts and develops over the course of hours without ever fully stopping to let the audience settle into the comfortable familiarity of a repeated tune. The harmonic language of Tristan und Isolde, in particular, pushed tonality, the system of keys and harmonic relationships that had organized Western music for nearly 3 centuries, to the very edge of its coherence, and in doing so pointed toward a dissolution that would be completed by the composers of the following generation. Because what came after Wagner was the question of what to do with the harmonic inheritance he had left behind, an inheritance so rich and so destabilized that it could not simply be continued, only either abandoned or exploded. Gustav Mahler chose, in some sense, to do both at once. His 9 completed symphonies, composed in the decades around the turn of the 20th century, are vast, turbulent, contradictory things, works that contain within themselves the whole range of the Austro-German musical tradition, from folk song to the most sophisticated orchestral counterpoint that can shift within a few measures, from the naively simple to the overwhelmingly complex, from what sounds like a child's song to what sounds like the end of the world. Mahler said that a symphony must contain everything, and his own symphonies strain toward that impossible totality with an urgency that can feel at times almost frightening. And even as Mahler was writing his enormous symphonies in Vienna, a younger composer in the same city was quietly assembling the materials for a revolution that would change the sound of Western music more completely than anything since the invention of polyphony 1,000 years earlier. Arnold Schoenberg, who was born in Vienna in 1874 and who began his career writing music in the late romantic style of Brahms and Wagner, arrived through a process of gradual harmonic radicalization that he himself experienced as inevitable and necessary at the complete abandonment of tonality. His 12-tone system, in which all 12 notes of the chromatic scale are treated as equal, with no single note privileged as a home base, was an attempt to find a new principle of musical organization to replace the tonal system that Wagner had eroded and that Schoenberg himself had finally dissolved. The music that resulted was unlike anything that had been heard before: angular, dissonant, intellectually rigorous, emotionally intense in a way that bypassed the usual melodic and harmonic pathways to emotion, and arrived, when it arrived at all, through roots that felt newly excavated. It was not music that was immediately loved by the general public, and in some ways it has never been widely loved, and yet its influence on the course of 20th century music was so pervasive that even composers who explicitly rejected its premises were defining themselves, consciously or not, in relation to it. The 20th century was a century of pluralism in music, of many different answers being proposed simultaneously to the questions that the dissolution of tonality had raised. Stravinsky's rhythmic primitivism, Bartók's synthesis of folk music and modernist technique, Shostakovich's bitter, sometimes desperate negotiation between artistic integrity and political survival under the Soviet regime, the minimalism of Arvo Pärt and Philip Glass, the spectral music of Gerhard Grisi, the American vernacular traditions that flowed in from jazz and blues and gospel and reshaped the entire global musical landscape, all of it flowing from the same deep source, all of it part of the same long, unbroken river that began in the stone chapels of the early medieval monasteries and has been finding its way forward ever since. The great composers, seen from a sufficient distance, form a kind of conversation across the centuries, each one responding to what came before, building on it, or pushing against it, or finding in some corner of it a neglected possibility that turns out to contain entire worlds. Bach knew Buxtehude's work and walked 200 miles on foot to hear him play. Beethoven studied with Haydn and carried Mozart's spirit in him like a living flame. Brahms revered Beethoven, and Schoenberg revered Brahms with an admiration that his own radical departures never diminished. Mahler conducted Wagner's operas and was changed by them. Debussy heard Javanese gamelan music at the Paris Exposition of 1889 and heard in those interlocking, shimmering textures a permission to let Western music breathe in an entirely new way. The conversation never ends. It only deepens, accumulating new voices and new perspectives, while somehow never losing the thread that connects it back to its origins, to the first solitary melodic line rising from a cold stone floor in the early morning, when the only light came through small windows and the only purpose was to reach, through the organized beauty of sound, towards something that lay beyond the reach of ordinary words. The hall is very quiet now, a different kind of quiet from the one that opened this long drifting evening, not the anticipatory silence of a room waiting to be filled, but the full silence of a room that has been inhabited by many things and holds them still, invisibly, in the texture of its air. The candles have burned lower, their flames smaller now, steadier, less inclined to flicker, as if they too have settled into something quieter and more concentrated after the long evening's journey. The harpsichord at the far end of the hall is still, and will remain still now for the rest of the night, its keys a little warmer, perhaps, than they were at the beginning, as if all the music that has moved through the mind this evening has left some small residue of warmth, even in an instrument that was never actually played. The portraits on the walls, those faces from other centuries, seem in the low light to have softened slightly the severity that formal portraiture tends to impose upon its subjects, giving way, in the mind's eye, to something more human, more recognizably the faces of people who felt things deeply, who struggled and doubted and found. In music, a way of making sense of the world that nothing else quite provided. Hildegard, looking toward a light that she described as living, Bach, bent over a manuscript in the early hours, surrounded by children and obligations and the perpetual pressure of the next Sunday's cantata. Mozart, writing by candlelight with that uncanny speed that seemed to those around him less like composition and more like transcription. Beethoven, placing his hands on the piano to feel its vibration through his skin, conducting an orchestra he could not hear, each of them giving everything they had, not to be remembered, though some of them hoped for that, not to change the world, though several of them did, but simply to follow the music wherever it led, for as long as they were able, with as much fidelity and as much courage as they could bring to the task. There is something in that dedication, something in the image of a person sitting down at a desk or a keyboard or an organ bench and reaching for something they cannot quite name but recognize when they find it, that feels less like a historical phenomenon and more like a description of something permanent, something that belongs not to any particular century, but to the ongoing human project of trying to be fully alive. The last of the amber light has faded from the windows now. The room is all soft shadow and the small steady glow of the remaining candles. The night fully arrived at last, complete in its gentle darkness. And in that darkness, if one listens very carefully, not straining, not searching, but simply remaining open to whatever is already there, it is possible to hear something that is not quite music and not quite silence, but belongs to the space between them, the space where all the music that has ever been played still lives, quietly, alongside all the music that has not yet been written, patient, unhurried, perfectly still, waiting for the next person who sits down and listens closely enough to hear it, and is moved once again to try to write it down. There is something quietly extraordinary about a place where the world gathers to imagine itself anew, where nations arrive with their finest achievements, their boldest dreams, and their visions of what tomorrow might hold. These are spaces that exist only briefly, temporary cities built for wonder, Vast grounds where pavilions rise like monuments to human ingenuity, and where millions of footsteps echo through gardens and exhibition halls, carrying with them the hope that we might glimpse the future before it arrives. I find myself walking through memory tonight, through the grand avenues of world fairs, those remarkable gatherings that have appeared across continents and centuries, each one a kaleidoscope of architecture and aspiration, each one a celebration of human creativity that blooms for a season and then vanishes, leaving behind only photographs and stories and the occasional tower that refuses to be forgotten. The air in these places always carried a particular quality, a mingling of anticipation and curiosity, the scent of new construction and distant cuisines, the sound of 1,000 languages braiding together into a kind of music, and always, always, the sensation that something unprecedented was unfolding just beyond the next pavilion, around the next corner, waiting to be discovered. Picture, if you will, a sprawling landscape transformed, what was once empty land or park or waterfront, becoming a fantastical realm of white plaster and steel, of electric lights strung like constellations, of fountains that catch the afternoon sun and throw rainbows across the pathways, where buildings rise in styles that blend the familiar with the utterly strange, where a medieval castle might stand beside a modernist tower, where temples and palaces and factories all coexist in harmonious impossibility. These gatherings have borne many names across the years: international expositions, universal exhibitions, world's fairs, expos, but beneath the varying titles lies a singular purpose: to gather the achievements of nations and display them for all to witness, to create a temporary museum of the present moment, a living catalog of where humanity stands at a particular point in time, and what moments they captured, these crystallized instants of collective ambition. Some arrived in eras of profound transformation, when steam was giving way to electricity, when the telegraph was shrinking distances, when the very pace of life seemed to be accelerating beyond recognition. Others emerged in times of recovery, when nations sought to demonstrate resilience, to prove that progress could continue even after devastation. And still others appeared during periods of intense competition, when countries vied to outshine one another with displays of technological prowess and cultural richness. But always, beneath the nationalistic pride and the corporate marketing and the political maneuvering, there existed something more intimate, more human, a child's first glimpse of a motion picture, a farmer from the countryside encountering electric light for the first time, an artist discovering techniques from a culture half a world away, a scientist examining innovations that would reshape entire industries. Tonight we walk through these vanished cities, these temporary wonderlands that once stood so solid and real, where visitors could spend an entire day and barely scratch the surface, where families saved for months to attend, where memories were forged that would last lifetimes. We trace the pathways between exhibitions, pause before the grand architectural statements, and consider the peculiar magic of a gathering designed to showcase everything, absolutely everything, that human beings had learned to create. The story of these fairs is not simply a story of buildings and inventions, though there are plenty of both. It is a story of aspiration, of the desire to see what others have accomplished and to be seen in turn. It is a story of cultural exchange happening at a scale both massive and oddly intimate. And it is a story that unfolds across more than a century and a half, from the first great gathering in a crystal palace to the sprawling digital spectacles of our present age. So let us begin at the beginning, when this tradition first took shape, when the very idea of bringing the entire world together under one roof seemed both audacious and somehow perfectly reasonable. When Victorian ingenuity and optimism combined to create something the world had never quite seen before. The year is 1851, and London is preparing to astonish itself. In Hyde Park, where fashionable Londoners have long strolled beneath ancient elms, something unprecedented is taking shape, a building unlike any the world has seen, constructed almost entirely of glass and iron, rising from the ground in sections that fit together with mechanical precision, gleaming in the pale English sunlight like an enormous jewel box, or perhaps a cathedral made of light itself. They are calling it the Crystal Palace, though the name feels almost inadequate for what it represents. More than 600,000 square feet of exhibition space, nearly 1 million square feet of glass, all supported by an intricate lattice of iron framework, and all of it assembled in less than a year, using prefabricated parts that arrived on wagons and were bolted into place like pieces of an immense puzzle. The architect, Joseph Paxton, had built conservatories before, greenhouses for the Duke of Devonshire's exotic plants, but nothing on this scale, nothing that would house not just rare orchids, but the industrial and artistic achievements of nations from across the globe. His design was radical in its simplicity, modular sections that could be repeated endlessly, a structure that could be erected quickly and, in theory, dismantled just as easily when the exhibition concluded. And inside this glass cathedral, beneath the arched roof that rose high enough to enclose the park's mature elm trees, the great exhibition of the works of industry of all nations began to take form. Britain, as the host nation and the world's foremost industrial power, claimed the western half of the building, filling it with steam engines and hydraulic presses, with textile machinery that could weave patterns of astonishing complexity, with locomotives and marine engines, with tools and instruments, with examples of every innovation that had made Britain the workshop of the world. The displays spoke of coal and steel, of factories and foundries, of an empire that spanned continents and commanded the seas, but the eastern half belonged to the world, or at least to those nations that chose to participate. And here the exhibition became something more than a showcase of British might. It became a conversation between cultures, a marketplace of ideas rendered in physical form. From France came exquisite porcelain and fine furniture, tapestries and bronzes, demonstrations of craftsmanship that reminded visitors that industry had not entirely supplanted art. From the German states arrived optical instruments and scientific apparatus, proof that precision and intellect could be as valuable as raw manufacturing power. The American contribution included Colt revolvers and McCormick's reaping machine, practical innovations that spoke to a young nation's pragmatic ingenuity. And then there were the more exotic displays, the ones that drew crowds throughout the long months of the exhibition. India sent elaborate textiles and the enormous Koh-i-Noor diamond, displayed in a gilded cage at the center of the building, attracting visitors who queued for hours simply to glimpse its fabled fire. Turkey contributed ornate fountains. China sent carved ivory and silk screens, and from across the empire came raw materials and finished goods that testified to Britain's global reach. The opening ceremony took place on the 1st of May, 1851, and Queen Victoria herself attended, along with Prince Albert, whose vision and determination had brought the entire project into being. 25,000 season ticket holders filled the central transept, while outside, thousands more gathered to catch a glimpse of the spectacle. The Queen recorded in her journal that the occasion was one of the greatest and most moving days of her life, that the sight of all those nations gathered peacefully, all that industry and art assembled under one roof, filled her with emotions too deep for words. Over the next 5 months, more than 6 million visits were recorded, though the actual number of individual visitors was certainly lower, as many returned again and again, unable to exhaust the wonders in a single day. Special train excursions brought working-class families from the industrial cities of the Midlands and the North, offering them their first glimpse of London, their first encounter with the sheer scale of human achievement laid out in orderly rows beneath that glittering glass roof. The exhibition was many things at once. It was entertainment, a spectacle that dazzled and delighted, where one could spend hours simply wandering, discovering marvels both grand and minute. It was education, a living encyclopedia where visitors could see and sometimes touch the products of distant lands, could watch machines in operation, could learn how things were made. And it was also, inevitably, a statement of power and hierarchy, a demonstration that Britain stood at the center of the world, that progress and civilization radiated outward from this small island, and that the future would be shaped by steam and steel and the restless ingenuity of industrial enterprise. When the exhibition closed in October, the question arose of what to do with the Crystal Palace itself. Some argued for its preservation in Hyde Park, but others insisted that the park must be returned to its original purpose. Eventually, the entire structure was dismantled, moved to Sydenham in South London, and reconstructed on an even grander scale, where it stood for more than 80 years, hosting concerts and exhibitions and displays until fire consumed it on a November night in 1936, leaving only the memory of its glittering presence. But the idea, the concept of gathering the world's achievements in one place, that proved less ephemeral than glass and iron. Paris watched London's success with interest, and perhaps with a touch of competitive spirit. The French had a long tradition of industrial exhibitions, national affairs that showcased domestic achievements, but the Crystal Palace had demonstrated something larger, something that captured imaginations and drew visitors from across continents. And so, in 1855, Paris hosted its own Exposition Universelle, smaller than London's effort, but distinctly French in character, emphasizing art and culture alongside industrial prowess, establishing a pattern that would define French exhibitions for decades to come. The Place de l'Industrie rose along the Champs-Élysées, a more traditional structure than Paxton's glass cathedral, built of stone and iron in a style that honored classical architecture while incorporating modern materials. Inside, the French displayed their renowned luxury goods, their wines and cognacs, their fashion and furniture, demonstrating that industrialization need not mean the abandonment of beauty and refinement, but it was the Paris exhibition of 1867 that truly established the French approach to world's fairs. The Exposition Universelle of that year occupied the Champ de Mars, a vast parade ground near the recently completed École Militaire, and introduced innovations that would influence every subsequent fair. The main building was arranged in concentric rings, with machinery and raw materials at the center, then manufacturing, then furniture and fashion, and finally, at the outermost ring, fine arts. Visitors could walk in circles, moving outward through the stages of production and refinement, or they could walk radially, comparing how different nations approached the same categories. Napoleon III and Empress Eugénie presided over an exhibition that drew more than 10 million visitors. The fairgrounds included separate national pavilions for the first time, allowing countries to create architectural statements that reflected their own cultural identities. The Egyptian pavilion, the Russian dacha, the Tunisian palace, these structures added visual variety and turned the exhibition grounds into a kind of architectural world tour, a miniature global village where one could experience multiple cultures in an afternoon's walk. And there was food, outdoor cafes and restaurants serving cuisines from across the participating nations, turning the act of eating into part of the cultural education. This innovation, so obvious in retrospect, helped transform world's fairs from purely industrial and educational events into something more social, more recreational, places where families could spend entire days, where the experience became about more than simply viewing displays. The American presence at the 1867 Paris exhibition was modest. The nation was still recovering from its civil war, still stitching itself back together, still finding its footing on the world stage. But American inventors and manufacturers who did attend took careful notes, observed the scale and spectacle, and began to imagine what might be possible if the United States were to host such an event. That opportunity arrived sooner than expected. In 1876, as the nation prepared to celebrate the centennial of its independence, Philadelphia would welcome the world to an exhibition that announced America's emergence as an industrial power that showcased a young nation's confidence and ambition, and that introduced millions of Americans to innovations that would transform their lives in the coming decades. But we are moving too quickly, jumping ahead before fully appreciating the pattern that was emerging in these early exhibitions. Each fair built upon the lessons of its predecessors, borrowed successful innovations, attempted to surpass what had come before. The exhibition buildings grew larger, the grounds more elaborate, the number of participating nations increased, and the public appetite for these spectacles seemed inexhaustible. In an era before mass media, before films and television and internet, World's Fairs offered a rare opportunity to see the world, to encounter foreign cultures and distant technologies without the expense and difficulty of actual travel. They arrived in a particular moment in history, these early exhibitions, a period when faith in progress felt almost boundless, when each year seemed to bring new inventions and improvements, when the application of science and industry promised to solve age-old problems of poverty and disease and ignorance. The exhibitions embodied this optimism, displayed it in tangible form, offered proof that humanity was advancing, that the future would be brighter than the past. And yet, even in these early celebrations of progress, there were complexities and contradictions. The same exhibitions that praised international cooperation often reinforced colonial hierarchies, displaying peoples from colonized lands as curiosities, as examples of cultures that had not yet achieved the industrial sophistication of European powers. The same events that celebrated human achievement often ignored the labor conditions and environmental costs that made such achievement possible. But on the fairgrounds themselves, beneath the exhibition halls and among the fountains and gardens, visitors experienced something simpler and more immediate. They witnessed wonders. They encountered the unfamiliar. They carried home memories of a magical place that existed briefly and then vanished, leaving behind only photographs and souvenirs and stories told to children and grandchildren. The Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition opened on a May morning in 1876, and with it, America announced its arrival on the world stage. Fairmount Park stretched along the Schuylkill River, transformed into a landscape of exhibition halls and gardens, of national pavilions and state buildings, all arranged with a careful eye toward both spectacle and practicality. The main building alone covered more than 20 acres under a single roof, making it the largest building in the world at that moment, a statement rendered in glass and iron that spoke of ambition and capability. President Ulysses Grant attended the opening ceremony, along with Emperor Dom Pedro II of Brazil, the first reigning monarch to visit the United States. Together they activated the enormous coreless steam engine in Machinery Hall, a monster of gleaming steel that stood 40 feet high and generated 1,400 horsepower, its massive flywheel turning with a steady rhythm that powered the machinery throughout the entire hall. Visitors would return again and again to watch it work, to stand in awe of its size and smooth precision, to feel the floor vibrate slightly with each revolution. But the coreless engine, for all its magnificence, was only the beginning. In the main building, nations displayed their finest products. Britain sent textiles and ceramics. France contributed wine and champagne alongside exquisite furniture and tapestries. Germany showcased precision instruments and scientific apparatus. Japan, recently emerged from centuries of isolation, presented an exhibition that captivated American audiences. Silk kimonos and lacquered screens, porcelain and prints, an aesthetic entirely different from European traditions, introducing many Americans to what would become a lasting fascination with Japanese art and design. The Women's Pavilion stood as a revolutionary addition, the first building at any World's Fair devoted entirely to women's achievements. Inside, visitors found inventions and artwork, scientific instruments and literary works, all created by women, challenging assumptions about gender and capability. The building itself had been designed by a woman architect, and much of its construction had been overseen by women, making a quiet but insistent argument about competence and equality. And then there was Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, demonstrated in a modest display that most visitors initially overlooked. A curiosity, they thought, a toy perhaps, but certainly not something that would transform human communication. Dom Pedro himself picked up the receiver during a demonstration, listened to Bell reciting Shakespeare from the other end of the wire, and reportedly exclaimed in amazement, "My God, it talks." The telephone was not alone in its prophetic significance. Thomas Edison displayed his automatic telegraph, hinting at innovations still to come. George Westinghouse showed his air brake system for trains. Heinz offered samples of their ketchup, and the Remington Company introduced the typewriter to a broader public. Each of these items seemed interesting, but not necessarily revolutionary. Yet within 2 decades, telephones and typewriters would become common in offices across the nation, fundamentally altering how business was conducted. Nearly 10 million people attended the Philadelphia exhibition over its 6-month run, many of them traveling by train from distant states, experiencing perhaps their first journey away from home, their first glimpse of a major city, their first encounter with the wider world. The fairgrounds offered not just education and spectacle, but also simple pleasures, lemonade stands and beer gardens, band concerts and fountains, benches where weary visitors could rest and watch the crowds pass by. The exhibition's success emboldened other American cities. Each wanted to demonstrate its own importance, its own claim to cultural and economic significance. New Orleans hosted an exposition in 1884, celebrating the centennial of the Louisiana Purchase and showcasing the recovering South. Chicago began planning even as construction continued, dreaming of something grander than anything yet attempted. But before Chicago could realize its ambitions, Paris would stage the exposition that established the template for all future fairs, that introduced innovations in architecture and engineering that still resonate today, that gave the world an icon that would become synonymous with the city itself. The Exposition Universelle of 1889 marked the centennial of the French Revolution, a celebration both national and international, occupying the Champ de Mars and the surrounding areas, transforming a significant portion of central Paris into exhibition grounds. The centerpiece, the element that dominated every view, that sparked controversy and admiration in equal measure, was Gustave Eiffel's tower. The tower rose 984 feet into the Parisian sky, constructed entirely of wrought iron in an open lattice design that seemed to defy conventional architectural wisdom. Critics called it monstrous, a metal skeleton that ruined the classical beauty of Paris. Artists and writers signed petitions demanding its removal. But the public fell in love. Visitors could ascend by elevator or stairs, climbing through the iron framework, watching the city spread out below them in ever-widening panoramas. From the top platform, on clear days, the view extended for miles, encompassing all of Paris and the countryside beyond. The experience of being so high, of seeing the familiar city from such an unfamiliar perspective, created a sensation that photographs and descriptions could not fully capture. You had to be there, had to feel the slight sway in the wind, had to look down through the open lattice and see the fairgrounds reduced to miniature far below. The Eiffel Tower was meant to be temporary, to stand for the duration of the exhibition and then be dismantled, but it proved too useful. Its height made it perfect for radio transmission experiments, and too beloved. Parisians who had initially protested its construction now defended its preservation. It remained, becoming over time not just a symbol of Paris, but an emblem of human engineering achievement, proof that beauty could emerge from industrial materials and mathematical precision. The 1889 exposition introduced another innovation that would become standard at future fairs. The Gallery of Machines, an enormous hall with a span of 375 feet, featured a moving platform that carried visitors past displays of industrial machinery, allowing them to observe without walking, to cover more ground in less time. The platform moved slowly, matching the pace of a gentle stroll. But the effect was nonetheless magical, as if the exhibition itself were a kind of theater, with visitors as audience members being transported through carefully choreographed scenes. Electric lighting, still relatively novel, illuminated the fairgrounds after dark, turning the evening into another kind of spectacle. The Eiffel Tower glowed with thousands of gas lamps, later replaced by electric lights, becoming a beacon visible from across the city. Fountains played in colored lights. Pavilions were outlined in electric bulbs, and the fair took on a dreamlike quality in the darkness, a temporary city of light and wonder. More than 32 million people attended the Paris Exposition, a staggering number given the population and transportation limitations of the era. Special trains brought visitors from across Europe, and steamships carried Americans and others from more distant shores. The fair ran from May through October, encompassing the entire summer season, allowing ample time for repeat visits, for careful exploration of the countless displays. The national pavilions had grown more elaborate, more architecturally adventurous. Egypt constructed a street of Cairo, complete with shops and cafes and costumed performers, offering visitors an imagined experience of North African life. Though filtered through European expectations and Orientalist fantasies, the Dutch created a village, the Austrians a castle, each nation using architecture to tell a story about itself, to present an identity to the international audience. And there was Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, performing just outside the official exhibition grounds, drawing enormous crowds with its romanticized portrayal of American frontier life. Cowboys and Indians, sharpshooters and bronco riders, reinforcing stereotypes about the American West, even as that frontier was rapidly disappearing. The show's popularity demonstrated the public's hunger not just for industrial progress, but for narrative, for entertainment that told stories and created emotional experiences. Chicago watched Paris's triumph with determination. The young city on Lake Michigan, still recovering from the devastating fire of 1871, wanted to prove that American ambition could match European sophistication, that the New World could create wonders equal to anything the Old World offered. The city bid for the 1893 World's Fair, competing against New York and other established eastern cities, and won, much to the surprise and consternation of those who viewed Chicago as rough and culturally underdeveloped. The World's Columbian Exposition, as it was officially named, commemorated the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas, though it opened a year late in 1893. The site chosen was Jackson Park, a marshy area along the lakefront that would require massive landscaping and engineering efforts to transform into suitable exhibition grounds. Daniel Burnham, the chief architect, assembled a team of designers who would create what became known as the White City, a carefully planned ensemble of Grand Beaux Arts buildings, all painted white, all arranged around lagoons and canals and formal gardens. The architecture deliberately evoked classical Rome, with columns and domes and ornate decoration, creating a vision of harmonious civic beauty that contrasted sharply with the industrial chaos and grime of Chicago's actual neighborhoods. The Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building covered 31 acres, making it the largest building in the world at that time, large enough to require its own internal transportation system. Its roof arched 150 feet above the floor, supported by enormous iron trusses, creating an interior space so vast that weather patterns could form inside. Mist rising from the displays on humid mornings. But for all the grandeur of the White City, the exposition's most revolutionary contribution stood apart from the classical ensemble along a strip called the Midway Plaisance, a boulevard connecting Jackson Park to Washington Park. The fair's entertainment zone emerged. Here, the high-minded educational purpose of the main exhibition grounds gave way to something more frankly commercial, more openly entertaining. Concessions offered exotic foods and performances. The streets of Cairo featured belly dancers. The Javanese village displayed traditional crafts. The Irish village sold lace and whiskey. Each concession presented a simplified, often stereotyped version of a culture, designed to amuse and intrigue rather than to educate with nuance. And rising above the Midway, dominating the skyline, turning slowly against the clouds, stood George Ferris's wheel, 264 feet in diameter, carrying 36 wooden cars that each held 60 passengers. The Ferris wheel answered the Eiffel Tower's challenge. America could build wonders too, could create experiences that inspired awe and delight. The wheel turned slowly, taking 20 minutes to complete a full rotation, carrying passengers high above the fairgrounds, offering views of the White City and Lake Michigan and the sprawling city beyond. Riding the Ferris wheel became almost obligatory, a required experience for anyone visiting the exposition. Passengers crowded into the cars, felt the gentle sway as the wheel lifted them skyward, watched the fair spread out below in ever-increasing detail. The experience combined thrill with tranquility, a slow ascent that built anticipation, a pause at the summit where the view seemed to stretch forever, and then the gradual descent back to earth. More than 27 million people attended the Columbian Exposition, nearly half the population of the United States at that time. They came by train from every state, spent days or weeks exploring the fairgrounds, carried home memories that would last lifetimes. For many, particularly those from rural areas, the exposition offered their first encounter with electricity, their first ride on a moving sidewalk, their first taste of foods from distant cultures, their first glimpse of artwork from European masters. The success of Chicago's White City established expectations that would shape world's fairs for the next half-century. Every subsequent exposition would need its iconic structure, its architectural signature, something that could be photographed and remembered, something that announced the fair's significance before a single visitor passed through the gates. Buffalo hosted the Pan American Exposition in 1901, featuring buildings painted in brilliant colors, yellows and oranges and reds, a deliberate contrast to Chicago's white classicism. The fair's centerpiece was the Electric Tower, rising 375 feet above the fairgrounds, covered in lights that made it glow like a beacon after dark. The entire exposition celebrated electricity, with more electrical illumination than had ever been concentrated in one place, creating nighttime spectacles that drew crowds who simply wanted to stand and stare at the brilliance. But Buffalo is remembered now for tragedy more than triumph. President William McKinley attended the fair in early September, shaking hands with visitors in the Temple of Music, when an anarchist named Leon Czolgosz approached with a concealed revolver and fired twice. McKinley died 8 days later, and the exposition, which had been meant to celebrate progress and hemispheric cooperation, became instead the site of national mourning. The tragedy did not stop the momentum of World's Fairs. If anything, it seemed to intensify the desire to gather, to celebrate, to demonstrate that violence and darkness could not extinguish the spirit of innovation and cooperation. St. Louis took its turn in 1904, commemorating the centennial of the Louisiana Purchase with an exposition that sprawled across Forest Park and the surrounding grounds. The fair was enormous, larger than any previous American exposition, with 1,500 acres of exhibits and attractions. The Palace of Electricity alone covered 9 acres, filled with dynamos and generators and demonstrations of how electrical power could transform daily life. The St. Louis Fair introduced the world to ice cream cones, though the exact origins remain disputed, and popularized iced tea, served cold to combat the oppressive summer heat. These culinary innovations, small in themselves, demonstrated how fairs served as testing grounds for commercial products, places where businesses could gauge public reaction and generate publicity. The Philippine Reservation at St. Louis covered 47 acres, displaying 1,200 Filipinos from various ethnic groups, living in reconstructed villages, performing traditional activities for crowds of spectators. The exhibit was explicitly colonial, designed to justify American occupation of the islands by portraying Filipinos as primitive peoples who needed American guidance and civilization. The racism was blatant and intentional, part of a larger pattern in which World's Fairs presented non-European peoples as curiosities or examples of evolutionary backwardness. This darker aspect of World's Fairs grew more pronounced in the early 20th century, even as the exhibitions celebrated enlightenment and progress. Human zoos, as they came to be called, featured prominently at fairs in Brussels and Paris and elsewhere, reducing living people to displays, reinforcing hierarchies of race and culture that justified colonial exploitation. The same events that showcased technological marvels also perpetuated profound injustices, demonstrating the contradictions embedded in these celebrations of human achievement. San Francisco rose from the ashes of the 1906 earthquake to host the Panama Pacific International Exposition in 1915, celebrating the completion of the Panama Canal and the city's own recovery. The fair occupied reclaimed land along the waterfront, with buildings in a romantic Spanish colonial style, pastel colors and red tile roofs, gardens filled with flowers and palm trees, creating an atmosphere more relaxed and pleasure-oriented than the grand classical statements of earlier fairs. The Tower of Jewels rose above the fair, covered with more than 100,000 glass gems called Nova Gems, which captured and reflected light, creating a shimmering effect that changed throughout the day. At night, searchlights played across the tower, making the jewels sparkle like stars. The effect was magical, transformative, turning architecture into something alive and dynamic. But the shadow of war hung over the San Francisco Exposition. Europe was already embroiled in the conflict that would become known as the Great War. And while the United States remained neutral for the moment, the absence of major European participants gave the fair a hollow feeling. Germany had planned an elaborate pavilion, but withdrew. France and Britain sent only modest displays, their resources diverted to the war effort. After the war ended, the world's fairs continued, but something had shifted. The boundless optimism of the Victorian and Edwardian eras had been shattered by the mechanized slaughter of the trenches. Progress no longer seemed an unalloyed good when it produced poison gas and aerial bombardment. The relationship between technology and human welfare had grown more complicated, more ambiguous. The Paris Exposition Internationale des Arts Décoratifs et Industriels Modernes in 1925 gave the world a new term, Art Deco. Derived from the exhibition's name, the fair celebrated modern design, sleek lines and geometric patterns, luxury and craftsmanship applied to contemporary forms. It was smaller than the grand universal expositions, more focused, but influential in shaping aesthetic sensibilities for the next 2 decades. Chicago returned to the World's Fair stage in 1933, marking the city's centennial with the Century of Progress Exposition. The fair ran for 2 seasons, drawing millions despite the depths of the Great Depression, offering a vision of technological optimism at a moment when faith in the future seemed scarce. The architecture broke decisively with classical tradition, embracing modernist principles, buildings painted in bold colors, streamlined forms that suggested speed and efficiency, structures designed around steel frames and prefabricated panels. The fair's motto was, "Science finds, industry applies, man conforms," a phrase that captured both the technocratic confidence of the era and an unsettling vision of human adaptation to technological imperatives. Exhibits demonstrated air conditioning and diesel engines, the latest advances in chemistry and manufacturing. Television appeared in experimental form, showing fuzzy images that hinted at future possibilities. The Skyride carried visitors in rocket-shaped cars suspended from cables, crossing the fairgrounds high above the crowds, offering another new perspective, another way of seeing, but it was the New York World's Fair of 1939 that would define the genre for a generation, that would create images and memories that still resonate, that would offer a vision of tomorrow that seemed both attainable and impossibly distant. The fair opened in Flushing Meadows, Queens, on land that had been a notorious ash dump, transformed through massive earth-moving and landscaping into a respectable exhibition ground. The theme was the world of tomorrow, and every element of the fair pointed toward the future, toward a streamlined, technologically advanced world where machines would eliminate drudgery and abundance would be universal, and the Trilon and Perisphere became the fair's symbols, a 700-foot spike rising beside a 200-foot diameter sphere, both painted gleaming white, both utterly modern in their geometric purity. Inside the Perisphere, visitors descended on escalators to view Democracy, a model of a planned city of the future where rational design would create harmony and efficiency, where highways and housing and industry would be integrated in perfect balance. General Motors presented Futurama, designed by Norman Bell Geddes, a vision of America in 1960. Visitors sat in moving chairs that carried them above an enormous diorama, looking down on a landscape of superhighways and modern cities, of controlled access expressways that would eliminate traffic congestion, of clean industrial parks and suburban developments. The vision was seductive, progress rendered in miniature. A future that seemed both logical and desirable, waiting just 20 years ahead. The RCA Pavilion demonstrated television, still experimental but clearly destined for commercial development. Visitors could see themselves on screen, an experience that was simultaneously thrilling and slightly unsettling, watching their own image broadcast through invisible waves. The implications for communication and entertainment were obvious, though few could have predicted the medium's eventual cultural dominance. The fair drew millions over its 2 seasons, 1939 and 1940. But the shadow of war grew darker each month. Hitler had invaded Poland in September of 1939, even as the fair continued its celebration of peaceful progress. By the time the fair closed in October 1940, much of Europe was at war, and the United States was edging closer to involvement. The future imagined at Flushing Meadows, that streamlined world of prosperity and harmony, would have to wait. After World War II, the world's fairs resumed, but they evolved in character and purpose. Brussels hosted Expo 58, featuring the atomium, a structure representing an iron crystal magnified 165 billion times. The building reflected the atomic age's fascination with fundamental structures, with the invisible forces that shaped matter and energy. It was futuristic and optimistic, presenting nuclear power as a force for peace and progress rather than destruction. Seattle's Century 21 exposition in 1962 gave the city its Space Needle, a structure that captured the space age enthusiasm of the Kennedy years. The fair celebrated science and space exploration, looking upward rather than merely forward, imagining a future among the stars. New York hosted another World's Fair in 1964, returning to Flushing Meadows with another vision of tomorrow. The Unisphere stood at the fair's center, a steel globe 120 feet in diameter, representing global interdependence and the space age. IBM and General Electric and other corporations created elaborate pavilions using emerging technologies like computers and animatronics to create immersive experiences. Walt Disney contributed several attractions, including It's a Small World, a boat ride featuring hundreds of singing animatronic children, representing unity through cultural diversity. The attraction was simultaneously charming and somewhat eerie, its relentless optimism and simplified cultural representations reflecting both the best intentions and the limitations of the era's internationalism. But even as these fairs attracted millions, the format was beginning to feel dated. Television and jet travel had made the world more accessible. The wonders that once required a journey to a fairground could now be encountered through other means. The unique role that World's Fairs had played, bringing distant places and future possibilities within reach of ordinary people, was diminishing. Montreal's Expo 67 marked perhaps the last truly successful fair in the grand tradition, celebrating Canada's centennial. The exposition occupied islands in the St. Lawrence River, with pavilions designed by leading architects from around the world. The United States built Buckminster Fuller's geodesic dome, a soaring sphere of interconnected triangles. Habitat 67 showcased modular housing, concrete blocks stacked in irregular patterns, suggesting new approaches to urban living. More than 50 million people attended Expo 67, drawn by the architecture and the optimism, by the sense that the fair captured a particular moment of possibility. The 60s were still mostly hopeful in 1967. The darker turns of 1968 and beyond had not yet arrived, and the fair reflected that brief window when technology and culture and internationalism seemed aligned toward positive ends. After Montreal, the decline became clear. Osaka in 1970 drew enormous crowds in Japan, but made little international impact. Spokane in 1974 was modest in scale, focused on environmental themes, but lacking the grandeur of earlier fairs. New Orleans in 1984 struggled financially, demonstrating that the economic model of World's Fairs had become unsustainable. The reasons were multiple and interconnected. Rising costs made the massive construction projects difficult to justify. Television and later the internet provided easier access to information and spectacle. Tourism had become global, making the educational component of fairs less unique, and perhaps most significantly, the narrative of inevitable progress that had sustained World's Fairs for more than a century had frayed. The late 20th century brought environmental awareness and post-colonial critique, technological skepticism, and cultural complexity, making the optimistic certainties of earlier fairs seem naive or even dangerous. Yet the tradition persisted, evolved, adapted. The Bureau International des Expositions in Paris continued to sanction official World's Fairs, now called Expos, every few years. Seville in 1992, Lisbon in 1998, Hanover in 2000, Shanghai in 2010. Each attempted to address contemporary concerns: sustainability, cultural diversity, digital technology. But they no longer occupied the central cultural position they once held. They had become one option among many, interesting perhaps, but no longer essential. And yet, there is something worth considering about what these gatherings represented, something beyond the buildings and the inventions, beyond the nationalism and the commerce. They were attempts to make the abstract tangible, to give physical form to the idea of human progress, to create spaces where the entire sweep of achievement could be witnessed in a single day. A farmer from Iowa could stand before machinery from Germany. A shopkeeper from Paris could taste tea from Ceylon. A child from any nation could watch electric lights banish darkness. And in those moments, something shifted. The world became smaller, more comprehensible, more connected. The fairs existed in a curious temporal space. They looked backward, celebrating what had been accomplished, showcasing the journey from past to present, but they also looked forward, presenting prototypes and possibilities, offering glimpses of what might soon become commonplace. A visitor in 1851 could see the telegraph connecting distant cities. Someone in 1939 could watch television broadcasts, experiencing technologies that would reshape their world within their lifetimes. And always, there was the architecture, those temporary cities built for wonder. The buildings were never meant to last. Most were constructed of plaster and wood, designed to stand for 6 months, perhaps a year, and then be demolished. Their impermanence was essential to their nature. They could be fantastical, excessive, experimental, precisely because they didn't need to endure. An architect could design a palace of machinery or a tower of light without worrying about maintenance costs or long-term structural integrity. The buildings existed to create impressions, to generate memories, to serve as backdrops for the performances of progress. Yet some refused to disappear. The Eiffel Tower was meant to be temporary, but became permanent. The Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco survived its exposition and still stands, transformed into a museum and public space. These structures that outlasted their intended purpose became monuments to the fairs themselves, physical reminders of gatherings that otherwise vanished completely. The gardens deserve mention too. The landscapes that surrounded the exhibition halls. Frederick Law Olmsted designed the grounds for the Chicago Fair, creating lagoons and islands, planting thousands of trees and flowers, using landscape as an integral part of the experience. Visitors could rest in carefully designed natural settings, could move between the dense stimulus of the exhibition halls and the calmer contemplation of gardens and waterways. The landscape design recognized that spectacle required balance, that wonder could be exhausting, that beauty took many forms. And there were always fountains, water features that caught light and created sound, that provided focal points and gathering spaces. The Columbian Fountain in Chicago, the Electric Fountain in Buffalo, countless others whose names are forgotten, but whose presence shaped the fairground experience, water in motion, catching sunlight, offering visual interest that required no explanation or context, simply beautiful for its own sake. The music, too, live, orchestras, and military bands, performances from visiting musicians, national anthems and popular songs, creating an auditory landscape as rich as the visual one. Before recordings became ubiquitous, live music was the only kind, and the fairs employed hundreds of musicians, creating soundscapes that varied from building to building, from hour to hour. The experience of moving through the fairgrounds was simultaneously visual and auditory, a multimedia experience before that term existed. The food, already mentioned, but worth returning to, the mixing of cuisines, the introduction of exotic flavors, the democratization of tastes that had once been available only to the wealthy or well-traveled. A World's Fair could be someone's first encounter with coffee from Brazil, chocolate from Switzerland, spices from India. These tastes carried associations, connected to places and cultures, turned abstract geography into sensory experience. And what of the people themselves, the millions who attended? What did they carry away? Some found inspiration for careers, seeing machinery or artwork that shaped their ambitions. Engineers and artists and scientists who trace their vocations to a childhood visit to a World's Fair. Others found broader perspectives, realizing that their own culture was one among many, that different approaches to art and architecture and daily life were equally valid. For some, the fairs challenged prejudices, though they reinforced them for others. The fairgrounds created temporary communities. Strangers walked together, shared wonder and exhaustion, exchanged observations and reactions. For a few hours or days, people from vastly different backgrounds occupied the same space, pursued the same goal of seeing everything, experiencing everything. They were not equal. Class and race and nationality created hierarchies even on the fairgrounds, but they were more mixed than in most contexts, more likely to encounter difference. The photographs that survive, Faded images of crowds and buildings capture something of this. The formal architectural shots show empty plazas and pristine facades, but the candid images reveal masses of people, women in long skirts and elaborate hats, men in suits despite the summer heat, children pressing close to their parents, everyone dressed in their finest, treating the fair as an occasion that demanded respect and formality. And at night, when the electric lights transformed everything, when the buildings glowed and the fountains played in colored illumination, when the fairgrounds became something magical and unreal, the nighttime fair was different from the daytime version, more romantic, more mysterious. The harsh details softened in the glow, the crowds thinned slightly, and walking the grounds after dark became an experience unto itself, a kind of dream made visible. The world's fairs were always about imagination, about the capacity to envision something different and then build it, however briefly. They required faith that people would come, that they would care, that the effort and expense of creating these temporary wonderlands would prove worthwhile. And for more than a century, that faith was repeatedly validated. Millions came. Memories were made. The culture was shaped by these gatherings in ways subtle and profound. Now the fairs continue in altered form, smaller perhaps, more focused on specific themes, sustainability, or digital innovation or cultural exchange. They happen in cities around the world, Dubai and Milan and Osaka, drawing visitors who are often more interested in the national pavilions than in grand unifying narratives about progress. The age of world's fairs as major cultural events has perhaps passed, replaced by other forms of global gathering, by the Internet's constant connectivity, by the ease of international travel that makes experiencing other cultures directly more accessible. The unique role they played, that combination of education and entertainment, that physical gathering of the world's achievements in one place, is harder to justify in an era of instant information and virtual presence. And yet, there is something lost, something that cannot be replaced by screens or jet travel. The fairgrounds created experiences that were simultaneously individual and collective. You walked through alone or with companions, following your own interests and curiosities, but you did so surrounded by thousands of others engaged in the same quest. You encountered wonders designed specifically to create that sense of encounter, arranged and displayed with care and intention, curated to tell stories about nations and technologies and possibilities. The temporary nature of it all added poignancy. You knew it wouldn't last, that in a few months the buildings would come down, the exhibits would disperse, the grounds would return to their previous purpose. This knowledge shaped the experience, made each visit feel precious, created urgency to see everything before the opportunity vanished. The photographs and souvenirs people carried home, the postcards and medallions and programs. These became more than mementos. They were proof that the experience had been real, that those magical buildings had actually stood, that the wonders witnessed had not been imagined. In an era before casual photography, before everyone carried cameras, these official images documented not just the fairs but entire trips, entire life experiences. Some visitors returned again and again, unable to exhaust the possibilities in a single day or even a dozen visits. They became students of the fairgrounds, knew the best routes through the crowds, had favorite pavilions they visited repeatedly, formed relationships with the place that were almost intimate, finding comfort in the familiar even as they continued discovering the new. And when the fairs closed, when the final day arrived and the gates shut for the last time, there must have been a particular kind of melancholy. A temporary city that had become beloved, that had occupied thoughts and conversations for months, was suddenly gone. The site would be cleared, the materials salvaged or destroyed, and only memory would remain. Those memories, though, they persisted. Grandparents told stories of the White City or the Trilon and Perisphere, showed faded photographs to children and grandchildren, kept the experience alive through retelling. The fairs became part of family histories, markers of time and experience, touchstones for understanding an era. Tonight we have walked through vanished landscapes, traced pathways that no longer exist, except in archives and imagination. We have stood before buildings that fell to wrecking crews decades ago, watched fountains that have long since stopped flowing. The world's fairs exist now primarily as echoes, as cultural memory, as proof that humanity has repeatedly gathered to celebrate its achievements and imagine its future. The glass palaces have shattered. The electric towers are dark. The Ferris wheels have stopped turning, but the impulse that created them, the desire to gather and share and wonder, that remains, taking different forms perhaps, finding new expressions, but still fundamentally the same. And somewhere tonight, plans are being drawn for the next exposition, architects sketching pavilions, organizers imagining themes, continuing a tradition that stretches back more than a century and a half, still believing that bringing people together, showing them wonders, creating spaces for encounter and imagination, still matters. The fairgrounds may be empty now, returned to parks or redeveloped into neighborhoods, but they were real once. They stood solid and magnificent, drew millions, created memories that lasted lifetimes, and that, perhaps, is enough to have existed, to have mattered, to have given people moments of wonder in an often difficult world. These temporary cities accomplished that again and again, before fading like dreams in morning light, leaving only stories, only echoes, only the quiet knowledge that such places once existed. And for those who saw them, nothing was ever quite the same.